Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Mrs. Goodwin plods somewhat ungraciously down the long corridors of this Georgia-based all-girls boarding school, which is situated in the southeastern region of the United States. She monotonously patrols every night to ensure that everything is running smoothly and that the girls have dutifully gone to sleep and are managing to behave themselves, if that's at all possible. But she knows the teenagers under her charge all too well. She smiles to herself when she hears their whispers and giggles as she slowly swings open the door to check on all those under her charge. She is met with a stiff, rigid silence, with one or two of the girls in the dorm unsuccessfully pretending to snore, just to convince her that they really are asleep. But Mrs. Goodwin is not easily fooled. She sees the industrious, spirited tricks that the enterprising, roguish young girls get up to at the school. And let's just say, nothing ever surprises her. She plunges the flashlight of her torch over all the girls, flickering obtrusively on the impish faces and lumpy bodies buried beneath the folds of the bed covers. One or two of the teenagers are scrunching their eyes ever so tightly, as if they're sleeping. But Mrs. Goodwin knows that no one ever falls asleep with screwed-up eyes like that, and mouths constricted so tightly into obvious pouts that clearly convey students desperately trying to suppress their laughter. Mrs. Goodwin has expeditiously worked in this boarding school for over 30 long years now. She knows how the mischievous, artful teenagers behave, how quick-witted and sharp they actually are, certainly at being able to pull the wool over the teacher's eyes. And most of them can pretty much lie with a straight face, should the need arise. When she closes the door quietly behind her, she hears the sniggers, giggles and hoots of suppressed laughter. "Did you hear me snore?" she hears one of the girls laughing. "I think I had Mrs. Goodiebags fooled." "No, you didn't, young lady," says Mrs. Goodwin under her breath, quietly to herself. "If you want to pull a fast one on me, try being a little subtle." Mrs. Goodwin walks away, down the long corridors and a couple of flights of steps, returning to her bedroom suite, nestled conveniently in the middle of the corridor. By all accounts, for Mrs. Goodwin, finding a job as a school matron 30 years ago had almost certainly saved her from herself. Let's just say looking after the young people here at the school had somehow insulated her from the wary woes of the world that could so easily deplete her joy. Mrs. Goodwin is well along in years, and every tiresome muscle and painful sagging twinge in her body reminds her of this fact. Mrs. Goodwin has ceased counting her age. She doesn't really want to entertain the fact that she's getting considerably older. I mean, who does? She had read an article about 10 years ago about scientists in England unable to comprehend why a woman was failing to age. It would seem that she emphatically believed she was still waiting for her husband to return from the Second World War, and her faith in his return was so pronounced that she was still stuck in a deceptive, misleading time warp, of her own creation, that is, earnestly believing with an audacious conviction that she was still that 25-year-old girl waiting for her husband to return from the war. Let's just say in her mind's eye, she had remained that young age, both physically and psychologically. Mrs. Goodwin believed that the mind was very powerful at influencing how we aged, so dwelling on your age was almost certainly not a good idea. That being said, Mrs. Goodwin noticed how she'd slowed down considerably physically, and her tired aching legs are now taking strain, walking down those long staircases to check the dormitories on the other floors. There are days when she really struggles on her feet, and it didn't help that she was suffering from a wee bit of arthritis in her knees and in her fingers. Life had not been easy for Nora Goodwin, when at 50 years old, her beloved husband Godfrey, a gift from the gods, had entered her life like a refreshing breeze, had died inauspiciously at 51 years old. Godfrey had been the quintessential love of her life, but he had been a big, goofy, lovable, lumbering klutz at the very best of times. The elephant in the room that would make the furniture just vibrate and shudder whenever he walked into a room, because he was that ungainly. Nora Goodwin had put this down to her husband's awkward proportions, with legs that were so long they dangled over the edge of their king-size bed, rather reminding her of a daddy-long-legged spider. Even when her husband had helped her with the washing up in the early years of their marriage, he had been so ham-handed with the dishes he'd broken more of them than successfully managed to wash any. When she had listened to him scrubbing the dishes in the sink, he sounded more like a rotary whisk on full throttle than a man gently washing dishes. "Honestly, Godfrey," she would exclaim, "can't you be gentle with anything? If you wash dishes with the zestful ebullience of a dough hook and a kneader, you're going to break every dish we have in this house." By all accounts, when they'd engaged in some ballroom dance lessons together, Godfrey Goodwin had stood on his wife's toes too many times to count, and had been so blissfully uncoordinated that the dance instructor herself had simply described him as the most bumbling dancer she'd ever had the pleasure to meet. It was clear that a graceful coordination and agility were not qualities that had ingratiated or endeared themselves to Godfrey's life, and it would seem they were to be his undoing. On the fateful, inauspicious day in question, that was quite literally to shatter Mrs. Goodwin's life, bringing down the walls of her home into a crumbling, messy heap, when Godfrey had decided emphatically that the congested autumn leaves that had blocked the drains needed to be washed out with a hosepipe, and that it would require getting up on the roof to clean them out, a job he was very eager to accomplish all on his own. He was blindly oblivious at how really cloddish he could be. Ostensibly there are people out there that should never climb trees or roofs, and there are people that should not drive cars. Godfrey was the former. "Are you kidding me?" Nora had said to her husband. "You're not getting up on that roof. You're not exactly that steady on your feet, Godfrey. Can't you wait for Keith when he does the lawn next week? He'll help you out." It would seem that the obstinate Godfrey was not to be dissuaded from the job he had in mind to do, and would not rest until he had done it. Rather like an itch he just had to scratch, and there was no stopping him. "Oh, come on, Nora. Stop overreacting, will you? It's only a few leaves I need to get rid of, for goodness sake. It's hardly going to kill me." Nora knew that her husband was as stubborn as a mule, resolutely determined to do what she perceived was a ridiculously precarious job, especially for someone as ponderously inept and maladroit as her husband Godfrey. She quickly scurried out of the house to watch her husband climb up the long ladder to the top of the roof with his hosepipe in his hands. Nora Goodwin's heart leapt into her mouth as she observed her bumbling husband literally stumbling over the roof, like Laurel and Hardy making a spectacle of themselves for one of their silent movies, or like an inebriated drunk. It would have been comical to watch if it hadn't been so disturbingly worrying. "Right, I'm ready, Nora. You can switch on the hosepipe for me," Godfrey had called out to her. "No, I don't think this is a good idea," she had said, with hands on hips in a defiant gesture, protesting as much as she could. "Must you do this, Godfrey? You don't look very sturdy on your feet. You know that you can be so cack-handed with things at the very best of times. I'm worried you're going to slip and fall and hurt yourself badly." Godfrey smiles down reassuringly at his wife, So sweetly, in fact, that it almost makes Nora's heart melt. "You worry too much, sweetheart. I'm absolutely fine. Now switch on the hose, won't you?" Nora obliges her husband's wishes. And as she expected, the hosepipe dances in her husband's hands like an excitable python, and more water was getting on the roof than down the drain pipes. The roof had become like a perilous ice skating rink. So Nora quickly retreats to switch the water off. "What are you doing, dear? Why did you switch the tap off? I need the water on." "Because, Godfrey, look at yourself. You're not getting any water where it's needed in the drain pipes. Look at you. Your clothes are soaking wet, they're sopping, and there's water all over the roof." Then, as she watches her husband trying to maintain his balance, like someone attempting to walk a tightrope, her husband wobbles clumsily, slips, and comes crashing down to the concrete paving below. His head bursts open like an ostrich egg, and it was over for him so fast. Mrs. Goodwin had stood there in abject silence. Her horrified, disbelieving eyes become as wide as saucers. Her mouth hangs open. Her stomach is doing flip-flops. She stands there like a plastic mannequin in a boutique, as white as a sheet, unable to even move a muscle. How long she stood there, she never remembered. But then the most dreadful scream emanated from the back of her throat that surprised even her. The noise echoed across the street with the shrillness of an ambulance siren. Her next-door neighbour, Gertrude Taylor, still in curlers, comes dashing very quickly out of her house to see what the god-awful commotion is all about, and on seeing Godfrey Goodwin, his head splattered across the asphalt like scrambled eggs, she too lets out a shrill scream. And let's just say, all eyes knew it was far too late for Godfrey Goodwin. "Silly man," says Mrs. Goodwin. "Silly, silly man. Why wouldn't he listen to me?" Nora Goodwin retreats from the dormitories, back to her beloved suite, where she'll soon return to the gilded picture of her beloved husband, which she has faithfully parked on her bedside table. He has remained a mere 51 years old, but she's now in her 80s. What would he make of her now, she would often wonder to herself. I mean, the age difference between the two of them would be immense. She jiggles the keys as she walks down the passageway, glancing briefly out at the dark night, over the ornate wrought-iron balustrades that frame the edges of the corridors, creating a balcony-like effect over the school grounds. But in the light of day, the views stretch out for many miles, overlooking the most spectacular, prepossessing views of the Georgia countryside. On the right-hand side of the school grounds is a distinctive square-shaped building. It has white small pokey windows and is the school changing rooms with lots and lots of lockers. There is a large square swimming pool with an elevated seating area for galas and swimming competitions. About 100 feet away from this seating area is a sumptuous wood grove that is begging to be explored, as it has a beguiling allure, comprised mainly of sweet gums, American beeches, oaks, and long-leafed pines. On the left-hand side of the school premises are the long flowing, perfectly manicured verdant lawns, scattered liberally with imposing mature oak trees, boasting large sculptural deportments and generous umbrella-like canopies that can shield many a hot student from the glaring, scorching hot weather. One of the largest oak trees in the grounds covers a concrete table that is used at tea time to provide the pupils that board at the school with orange juice, tea or coffee, and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for morning and afternoon breaks. It's only on Sunday afternoon that the sandwiches are replaced with jelly donuts and custard slices, something the children always look forward to. Mrs. Goodwin has fully embraced the rumours over the years, that is, well, as long as she's been matron at the school, and has been quick to inform any new girl about the spectral entity, or the resident ghost, to her advantage. It's always helped the restless young girls in the dormitories to dutifully retire to bed and behave themselves, as many a pupil has been desperately afraid of encountering the ghost of a 1940s headmistress called Mrs. Priscilla Lennox, whom is said to walk up and down the corridors here, and by all accounts was a very formidable woman. At first Mrs. Goodwin believed that the rumours about the ghost were idle speculation and the indulgence of an overactive imagination, but now she wasn't quite so sure. Mrs. Goodwin remembers one airy night in particular, when she was walking down the school corridors, alone, with her torch, when something untoward happened, of which she can find no rational explanation. She had been patrolling all the dormitories, walking down different flights of steps to the various different levels, looking into the dormitories to check on the sleeping students, under her diligent charge. She could hear the clip-clop sound of women's shoes walking down the corridors. She flashed her light to the left and right, from where she'd heard the idiosyncratic sound, but saw nothing. She knew that it couldn't be any of the residential pupils, as everybody was expected to wear sheepskin slippers. So then who was walking down the corridors late at night, wearing heels? "Hello! Hello!" she calls out in the darkness. "Can I help you? Is anybody there? Is anybody there?" But no one answered her. She was left with an ominous sense of foreboding. "Hello! Hello!" she repeated a few more times, but heard absolutely nothing, although the footsteps had stopped. But she got the sense that someone was watching her from the dark shadows. She was so frightened she dashed back to her quarters, spending the rest of the night sleeping with the lights on. But it did give her pause for reflection. Had she encountered the ghost of Priscilla Lennox? She was to learn that on several occasions people claimed to have heard the clippity-clop of women's heeled shoes. Mrs. Goodwin knows that beyond the so-called ghost here is something infinitely worse, much more ambiguous, loitering around in the dark shadows on the school grounds. Indeed, something that is so terribly bad that ever since the harrowing experience she has never been able to go anywhere near the Woodgrove. If the pupils knew about her secret, they would tremble in their boots, never get a wink of sleep at night. So she had wisely kept this clandestine secret, all to herself. One night she remembers being awoken to the sound of frantic girls' voices hammering on her door, calling out her name in an alarmed frenzy. She had woken up with a violent start, her worst fears realized. Had one of the children had a dreadful accident? Was someone hurt? Her heart began pounding in her chest as she nervously, apprehensively opens the door of her suite, to be welcomed by a sea of earnest, apprehensive faces that are staring at her with terrified eyes, bodies trembling like a vertical line of wobbling jellies. "What on earth is going on here? Mrs. Goodwin?" One of the girls is trembling. "Something is out there. It's howling. It's making a very strange noise, a terrifying noise. We're so scared. We can't get to sleep." "You go back to bed at once," said Mrs. Goodwin. "I'm sure it's absolutely nothing. It's possibly just a mountain lion or a coyote. Now off to bed. Do you hear me?" The young, rattled, chagrined and flustered girls obediently obey, trotting off to their dormitories. But it's clear they don't believe that what they heard was a coyote. In truth, nor does Nora. But she had to suggest that it was, to bring peace to the chaotic turbulence of the very discountenanced youngsters. She knows, of course, they're well familiar with the animal sounds here in this part of the world, and they're not acquainted to airy, disembodied, haunting sounds like this, that almost certainly invite every single hair on the back of your neck to stand up on edge. Mrs. Goodwin, on hearing the discomposing sound herself, finds that the mysterious, unsettling noise seems to pound at her chest like an impassioned wrestler's powerful punches, echoing through the looming dark shadows of the night, bouncing buoyantly around the lawns and buildings of the schoolhouse. It is such a disturbing wail, like nothing she's ever heard before. Nora Goodwin would like nothing better than to retreat back to her bedroom, closing the door behind her and forgetting all about everything, pretending that the ominous noise had never so rudely impregnated her reality like this. But something is out there, and she needs to find out what it is. She's the matron of the school, after all. It's her responsibility to keep the children safe from harm's way, even if it means doing something that seeps over the edge of her comfort zone. It's called being dependably responsible. An unsettling feeling, fraught with a restless pessimism, seems to saunter precariously down her spine, and she instinctively senses something is terribly wrong. Mrs. Goodwin is not exactly a courageous woman, at the very best of times. But despite her reluctant reticence, and her vacillating hesitancy. Her desire to protect the pupils under her charge trumps all her inhibitions, and is far more significant than her own fear. "Get a grip, woman," she scolds herself. "Get a grip." She hurries into her room to retrieve a rifle, a secret possession she decided to keep after learning about so many school shootings across America. Let's just say, if someone with a sawn-off shotgun entered the premises with the intention of harming one of the students here, she was determined to come to their rescue with a means of physical defense. If it meant having to kill the perpetrator, she would do it without even batting an eyelid, as protecting the children is her priority, one she takes very seriously indeed. Mrs. Goodwin grabs the rifle and her torch, trudging down the corridors and the sweeping flights of steps. She moves as quickly as she can, in her very impractical pink fluffy slippers that are not designed for navigating the yards on the premises here, while her dressing gown is tied tightly around her ample middle. When she reaches the bottom step on the ground floor, she plunges the key into the padlock that holds the lock in place. The chain jingles, sliding on the floor. The lock opens and loosens, while the wrought iron gate squeaks as it swings open. She cautiously locks the gate behind her, throwing the keys into her pocket, scurrying quickly past the headmistress's office. She can see the attractive silhouette of the school building on the edges of the corridor, with its large, friendly French windows that seem less welcoming tonight. Luckily, the outside lights are left on throughout the night, so that Mrs. Goodwin can see her way clearly past all the school classrooms. There is nothing congenial about this night whatsoever. It seems to claw at her with a hostile, vengeful ambience, as if the air she is breathing is tainted by an unsavoury energy. She willfully disregards those instinctive whispering voices in her mind, warning her not to proceed any further with her search. She hears the discomposing sound again, and discerns it's coming from the swimming pool area that is framed by a very substantial woodgrove. She hurriedly steps up her speed and runs across the grass, richly anointed and soaked with a moist dew that rubs against her pyjama bottoms, brushing her exposed ankles, making them soggy and wet. The night is menacing, bodeful, hostile in its demeanour, for even the gay shrill of the crickets and frogs has been extinguished, and the silence, like cancer, seems to grow through the night, like a tenacious, indomitable weed. And that is when she sees the provocative, haunting silhouette of only what the darkest, most malevolent nightmares can possibly be made of. She sees the shape of a huge canine wolf-like head, howling up at the moon. But this thing, whatever it is standing up on two legs like a man. I mean, how is that possible? It's easily over 8 foot tall, covered in thick black dense hair, with overlong arms that travel beyond the knees, and human-like hands and feet, with claws like that of a wolf. The creature continues to howl up at the moon, as if worshipping it like some kind of a demigod. Nora Goodwin's torchlight is fixed on the creature's back. What the hell is that? She thinks to herself. Then the most terrible thing happens. The creature slowly turns around, swivelling his head, to look directly at her, with bright red blazing eyes that sear through her like burning red-hot coals, that sear to the core of her heart. Nora Goodwin recoils in horror. She is appalled and disgusted by what she is perceiving. She freezes like an ice statue at a lavish banquet. Even her legs seem to stick to the ground, as if they're entrenched in bags of cement, so she can't even move a muscle. The creature has a muzzle so thickly doused in blood that droplets are literally dribbling off its jawline. It spitefully retracts its lips back to expose the most menacing mouthful of sharp canine teeth that are deplorably intimidating. It lets out the most gut-wrenching growl. Nora wants to scream, but there is a frog in her mouth. Her voice box has been seized, hijacked, held hostage and to ransom, to the most frightful, deadly fear. This creature looks like something so repugnant, so vile, that even the gates of hell are offended by it. They have regurgitated him from their depths, vomiting him out into our reality. Nora can feel an intense loathing, a despicable hatred emanating from this creature as it stares her down intently with a nauseating wrath. She knows her life is over when the creature lunges towards her. She is like a little mouse, frozen by such a malignant, cruel terror that she has become dinner for this beast, although by the looks of things he is eaten already. He is lunging towards her. She notices a dark silhouette in the forest. It screams like a banshee, in outraged indignation. Then hundreds of rocks are being hurled and thrown at the wolf-like creature, whom was about to attack Mrs. Goodwin. But now his attention has been miraculously diverted. His feathers are ruffled. He's very piqued by this noble interference that has incensed his haughty arrogance and pride. The creature becomes inflamed by fury and roars viciously. He dashes into the woodgrove after his assailant. Nora Goodwin knows something in the woodgrove saved her life that night. She suddenly realizes that this is her quintessential opportunity to escape to freedom. So she leapt out of her impractical pink slippers that would seriously hamper and jeopardize her progress, and charged like a March hare, escaping to the safe confines of its burrow. She does not know how she managed, in an urgently hurried, struggled scramble and muddled, disorientated confusion, to make it safely back to her living quarters, or how she succeeded to open the padlock on the keychain, with hands trembling and fingers as slick as butter, or how she dashed up the staircase and retreated safely back into her bedroom. But she did. It was as if her body was operating robotically. The following day she informs the boarders that the strange sound that they all heard was just an injured coyote, but judging by their disbelieving expressions, they hadn't fallen for her creative lie, which she thought might offer them a measure of solace, but it would seem she was wrong. One thing was for sure, none of those boarders would be allowed anywhere near that woodgrove from now on. But her experience with that werewolf-like creature would remain under lock and key. It was reassuring to note, after doing much research online about what she'd encountered, that there were other people, especially people visiting the Appalachian Mountains, that had experienced something as outlandish as she had done. Suffice to say, 76 miles of the Appalachian Trail are actually in Georgia, which starts in Fannin County, in Springer Mountain. So it wasn't impossible for these wolf-like beasts to be seen here in Georgia, possibly originating from those mountains. 1 month later, Nora Goodwin studies her reflection in the mirror, something she avoids doing whenever possible. She decides that her face looks like a wizened tortoise, wearing an unflattering bow-like haircut of wispy grey hair on its head. Even her brown, soulful eyes seem more sunken these days in their sockets. Over the years, Mrs. Goodwin has the responsibility of being a mother-like, nurturing figure to all the young ladies under her charge. She has helped nurse the scrapes from falls down the passageway with band-aids, and helped nervous girls deal with tormenting nightmares by offering them reassuring words of encouragement. What she has to do today is not a job for the faint-hearted, but it has to be done. This is a responsibility entrusted to her alone by the headmistress of the school. It is the worst part of her job, but if anyone has got to do it, she would rather it be her. She straightens out her tweed skirt, which is rather tight over her extended belly, and darts quickly down the stairs to the science laboratory, where she's been informed by the headmistress that the class in progress is currently engaged in looking at specimens of bacteria under the slides of their microscopes. Mrs. Goodwin knocks on the door, which is opened by Miss Sinclair, the science teacher, who gives Mrs. Goodwin a warm smile. "What can I do for you, Nora?" she asks. "If you could please ask Mackenzie to come to my room right now, when she's ready. I need a quick word with her. It's terribly important," says Mrs. Goodwin, popping her head around the door and giving Mackenzie a warm nod. Mackenzie's face grows as white as a sheet, as all eyes dive towards the young girl in hoops of sympathy. If the matron is calling out Mackenzie to her quarters, they know the news is not good. Rachel Dyer, who is Mackenzie's best friend, gives her an encouraging nudge. "I'm sure it's nothing, Mackenzie," she says, trying to hide the doubt between her comforting words. "I'll come with you if you like." "No, it's all right," says Mackenzie, straightening the skirt of her school uniform. "Like you say, it's probably nothing." What she says, she doesn't mean. Mackenzie is in no doubt. that Mrs. Goodwin calling her back to her suite is not nothing, but she's determined to remain positive. She leaves the classroom with fear gripping her heart so tightly she could swear it's almost stopped beating. Her mouth is impregnated with a baleful bitterness that has soured her taste buds. It feels as if her legs have almost been swept away by a landmine, as she can barely feel them beneath her at all, as she glides up 3 flights of stairs to Miss Goodwin's suite that is parked in the centre of the dormitories, on the landing of the 3rd floor. She knocks on the door so quietly, as she hopes Mrs. Goodwin might not have heard her. Then she can just run away and not face what she's about to hear now. "Come in, Mackenzie," says Mrs. Goodwin. Mackenzie cautiously presses open the door, her blue eyes glancing around Mrs. Goodwin's suite. She's never been in the sheltered intimacy of Mrs. Goodwin's living quarters before, at least not like this, so close up and personal. She observes that in the far corner of the room is a nifty-looking kitchen, done in an eclectic design. In the furthest corner of the room is a very wide, spectacular French window, overlooking the street, with its absolutely exquisite views, and a long ribbon of asphalt with large oak trees that gracefully frame either side of the street. There's a walnut sleigh bed, parked directly under the window, adorned with very glamorous vintage-looking burgundy covers. There's an inconspicuous door to the right, left slightly ajar, that she assumes leads into a private bathroom. She's standing in the living room area, surrounded by sumptuous-looking couches and a glass coffee table lined with interesting books with subjects like the Egyptian pharaohs and famous archaeological discoveries. There's a book on the Great Migration in Kenya. She had no idea that Mrs. Goodwin's interests ran so deep. "Please sit down over there, Mackenzie," says Mrs. Goodwin in a very gentle voice, pointing to a neat single upholstered chair. She sits at the edge of the chair nervously, her back as straight as a pencil, her fingers twitching, her legs tapping the carpet. Mrs. Goodwin pours Mackenzie a Coca-Cola over a large glass of ice cubes and hands it directly to the girl. "I'd like you to take a couple of sips of this," she says. "I've got something to tell you, something of a distressing nature, so you're going to need the sugar." Mackenzie's eyes widen. She takes a couple of sips of the sweet Coca-Cola, her eyes not daring to focus on Mrs. Goodwin. Mrs. Goodwin interlaces her fingers into an upside-down arch. She looks at Mackenzie awkwardly. "There was a dreadful accident, I'm afraid, on your grandfather's farm this morning, near Piedmont, I believe it is. It appears he got off his tractor to remove an obstacle in his path, but the tractor was still on. It was rolling forwards and ran over him. I'm afraid, I don't know how to say this, but he's dead." "My grandfather is dead! No! No!" cries Mackenzie. Dreadful sobs come bounding out of her mouth, like hysterical leaping frogs. "No! No! Please not my grandpa. He's my best friend. Please not him. Not him. Anybody else but not him. He was my best friend." "I know, sweetheart." Mrs. Goodwin cradles Mackenzie in the pillowy bosoms of her chest, while Mackenzie sobs into the material. "There, there," she says. "I know it's dreadful news, Mackenzie. I'm sure it was very quick. I'm sure he died instantly. Unfortunately, accidents like this do happen. My husband died falling from a roof. It's one of those things you can't get your head around. I do know how it must make you feel. There's nothing worse." "Am I going home?" asked Mackenzie. "I need to go home. I need to be with my mother, and I need to be with my dad. My dad's going to be so devastated. This is his father we're talking about. I don't know how we're going to cope." "Of course you're going to cope, and you are going to go home, Mackenzie. But you're going to have to stay at school for a couple more days. You see, your mother has to organise some relatives from Ireland on your father's side of the family to come over. But once that's sorted out, you'll be going home. She wants you to stay here for a couple more days. She wants you to be very strong. In the meantime, do what you want. You're excused from classes. If you need someone to talk to, I'm here any time of the day or night, 24/7. Do you understand that? I'm your confidant, your in-house mother, What you share with me is between us alone. Mackenzie's story. From the moment Mrs. Goodwin entered our classroom that day, with sombre eyes fixed directly on me, I knew something was terribly wrong. I couldn't believe that my grandpops was dead. He was my very best friend, my father's father. I could talk to him about anything, and to die in such an abrupt, impetuous, unheralded way was completely devastating for me. I decided to walk around the school grounds, to soak in my own melancholia, and I didn't care about the no access sign on the woodgrove, not any more, and certainly not today. Why should I care about silly rules and regulations, when the entire world had fallen on my shoulders? These were extenuating circumstances, any way you looked at it. Mrs. Goodwin had said I could do what I wanted today, and the woodgrove seemed to be calling my name, as if offering me solace in my grief. My grandfather used to tell me that the trees could listen to your heart and strengthen you in times when your heart was heavily burdened by despair and grief. I knew I'd feel close to my Gramps in a place like this. He was an outdoorsy man, an intrepid adventurer and a keen explorer, an eager hiker and mountain climber who embraced the rural backcountry with an insatiable zealousness that could never be muted or subdued. He had toiled, tilled and ploughed the soil since he was a strapping 18-year-old boy. He loved the earth, everything in it and on it, without exception. I put on my trainers and my tracksuit and proceeded into the woodgrove. It was hard to fathom that a day could be so beautiful when it was so wickedly tarnished with a devastating, sorrowful grief. I felt as if everything should be sobbing for my grandfather's fortuitous exit from this earth. But everything carried on like before. The birds tweeting, the trees rustling, a bee buzzing, a butterfly bobbing over the colourful flowers. There was a cheerful, eclectic mix of trees in the woodgrove, along with many a mature oak tree, with resplendent branches that stretched out so graciously in the canopy above my head, like lofty sculptural bronzed arms, that glistened with a leafy green bounty of sumptuous foliage. My eyes beheld a gossamer, irradiate light from the forest canopy that twinkled brightly through the trees and danced across the forest floor in a subtle luminescence. A couple of charming butterflies were darting around some pretty woodland flowers that arrested the viridescent scenery with their colourful, delicate blossoms. There was a soft breeze blowing generously, and it accompanied me on the walk like a refreshing companion who cooled down the inflamed heat of the searing pain that burnt a hole in my heart, while my trainers crushed twigs and leaves beneath my feet. Ostensibly the path was not altogether smooth. It was undulating and hilly, with the occasional angry rocks jutting out of the soil like large incisors. I could hear the tweets of the bird song trilling through the forest, and watched both a squirrel and a chipmunk eyeing me through dark twinkling eyes. For a moment it was like my grief floated away, like a bird on a wing, as I was mesmerized by the transfixing beauty of this place. I continued to amble along, overcoming obstacles along my path, like the occasional tree trunk that was carpeted in a thick layer of bountiful green moss. Finally I came to a stream, situated on a lower elevation in the woods, but I climbed down the hilly incline, and sat for ages on a smooth rock, where I collected handfuls of little stones to throw into the water. The water crashed and thundered so violently against the rocks. It bubbled up into a white foam, as it plundered down the forest in a downward trajectory. I sat there for a long time. How long, I'm not sure, but it was long enough. I sometimes gazed up at the little openings of the trees that invited a brief view of the perfect cobalt blue sky. While I sat there on the rock, I cried and cried until I could cry no more. But the forest seemed to cushion my grief, and the woodland trees seemed to commiserate with me, and whisper to me comforting words of solace that I did not audibly hear, but instinctively felt. And absurdly ridiculous as this may sound, I could feel the presence of my grandfather with me. I could almost see him standing there, with his Father Christmas white beard, his red bandana over his white hair, wearing his red plaid shirt and dungarees, and staring at me through his cornflower blue eyes. Suddenly the whole ambience of the forest changed. I noticed a couple of deers racing past me, barely noticing me at all. as if something had completely terrified them out of their wits. I'd never seen deer so agitated before, while a squirrel scurried away, and the birdsong in the forest suddenly evaporated, almost as if it had never ever been there. It was like the forest had become an inauspicious, hostile, malevolent place. I suddenly sensed I was not alone. Someone was there, but I didn't know who it was. Then I heard that roaring sound that I'd heard a month prior, that Mrs. Goodwin had tried to pretend was an injured coyote, but no one had believed such an absurd suggestion, not even for a second. At first blush, this hauntingly airy sound was so spooky, so discomposing. It vibrated into my chest like a clamorous, resounding bell. In a trice, a couple of acorns are thrown at me. I look up to see this dark creature standing behind the tree. I realize it's a Bigfoot. The creature is indicating for me to follow her. She makes her intentions clear. Then I hear the discomposing sound again. It travels through the forest expeditiously, at a cannonball-like efficiency. It's coming my way, and whatever it is, it sounds terrifying. The Bigfoot calls out to me. She speaks in a strange, alarmed voice, in a curious language. Her scrambled words are fast and furious. Her expression is charged with a poignant, troubled concern and very evident dismay. It's like she's warning me that danger's in my midst, and she wants to help evacuate me from it. But can I trust her? I hear the ponderous feet charging through the woods. I realize at once that the Bigfoot is trying to rescue me from this treacherous being that is bounding towards us at a rapid gallop. It's like my grandfather's voice is reassuring me that I can trust this Bigfoot, a creature I would normally have fled from in terror. But who do I trust more? The ambiguous owner of the disembodied roar, moving through the forest like a charging hellhound, or a Bigfoot that is expressing a genuine concern towards me? I move over towards her quickly. With one arm she swings me onto her back and jumps up into the tree branch of a very mature oak tree with very sturdy branches. She manoeuvres me so quickly that I don't have any time to protest or react adversely. She puts me down on an upper branch next to her. I'm not good with heights, and looking down from this level is daunting. But the Bigfoot covers me with a leafy green foliage to camouflage me, but is less concerned about concealing herself. Then I see him. I have never been so grateful to be hidden behind all this leafy green foliage that has rendered me inconspicuous and about as invisible as I'm going to get. Unarguably, through a little hole in the foliage, I discern a creature, whereupon your worst nightmares are most surely made. This creature is without doubt the most gruesome, ghastly predator that I have ever had the displeasure to encounter. He would make a male lion seem like a friendly little pussy-cat. This creature epitomizes all that is insanely evil, all that is duplicitous, all that is wicked. It belongs to the devil and his minions. This creature does not belong to our world, any more than an unwelcome weed belongs in our yard, or a tree branch belongs in the swimming pool. It shouldn't be here. It should not exist. There is something supernatural about the creature, and if you told me he was a demon, I would 1,000% believe you, for he is in my mind's eye exactly what you would expect to encounter in the flames of hell. The forest is suddenly infused with a most diabolical, offensive scent. It burns my eyes, scratches the back of my throat. It gives me the overwhelming desire to hurl up the contents of my stomach, but I manage to hold it together, although every part of my body is trembling. The Bigfoot gives my arm a reassuring nudge, as if to tell me it's going to be all right. I'm so relieved to be in her presence now. It's almost as if my late grandfather summoned her to my rescue, as bizarre as that may sound. The creature I'm viewing from the high branch of an oak tree is like a cross between a werewolf and a human, as his face is like a wolf. But that is where the similarity begins and ends. His bright red eyes are like the devil. His body is built like a powerful athlete, with sinewy muscle definition that is so pronounced it rather reminds me of the gnarled roots of the oak trees, as it bouges out of his body with an obscene, intrusive impertinence, while the body is densely covered with a crop of short, thick, shiny hair, and the legs are almost half human and half wolf. with talons that are so sharp they could shred you to pieces if given the chance or opportunity. The creature's nostrils are flaring, and I realize in that moment he has smelt my scent. He is looking for me. He seems puzzled and perplexed not to find me, but he does look up at the tree, and on seeing the Bigfoot, he unleashes the most terrifying roar. But he seems to be subdued by the Bigfoot's presence, as if he knows he can't take down a Bigfoot, but he'd like to try. Rather like the love-hate relationship you sometimes see between cats and dogs, where they have to learn to live together, but are not terribly pleased about it. The Bigfoot on the tree snarls back at the werewolf. She lifts up the edges of her mouth and lets out a high-pitched scream like an ambulance siren, and then she breaks off pieces of branches, throwing them down on the creature, that raises a fist at her, lets out another discomposing howl, and then thunders through the forest like a rhino charging over the wilderness, until it's finally gone. Not for a moment do I believe that the werewolf-like creature saw me, but boy, did he smell me, from miles away, entering what he assumes is his territory, I hasten to say. The female Bigfoot mumbles something, and then throws me on her back, rather like a large sack of potatoes, although on her back I'm probably like a very small one. And then she glides down the tree, and for a moment I stand there, staring at her, gawking. She was much taller and bigger than the werewolf, but she's got the kind of gentle demeanour that makes you believe she abhors violence, and a face on her that is so intrinsically human. She is serene and peaceful like the forest itself on a sunny day, and she appears so graceful, so dexterous, so agile. But it's her eyes that are very hard to explain. I know there are people out there that have had bad experiences with Bigfoot before, but hand on heart, this critter's eyes were just so filled with a compassionate, tender kindness, and there was not an uncongenial bone in her body. I think Bigfoots are remarkably like humans. They're good ones and bad ones. But unlike human beings who have prisons to incarcerate the most wicked among us in society, the same cannot be said for Bigfoots. I look at her directly in the eyes and say, "Thank you, thank you, you've saved my life," and I really believe she did. She escorts me safely through the forest, and I run back to my dormitory to ponder and reflect over the incongruous things that have just transpired, that demanded my attention so much that the level of grief became much more bearable for me. Suffice to say, I feel duty-bound to tell Mrs. Goodwin that I had disobeyed the sign and entered the woods. I want to warn her about what I'd seen, as I didn't want other kids to get into harm's way if there was a werewolf wandering around the place. I thought Mrs. Goodwin would laugh at my seemingly preposterous story, but she claimed to have seen the predator too. We both decided that this werewolf-like beast had certainly laid a territorial claim to the woodgrove on the school property, but there was a kindly Bigfoot watching over the people at our school, keeping this wicked predator in check. Mrs. Goodwin believed that the stones thrown at the werewolf on that fateful, tenebrous evening, when she was so nearly attacked by the vindictive beast, had been thrown by the same protective Bigfoot who had also delivered me from harm. 8 months later, Seraphina's story. I was a new pupil at this Georgia boarding school, the name of which I will keep shrouded in mystery for obvious reasons. My parents believed that I was rather an undisciplined pupil that was always getting up to mischief and was boycotting my homework every day of the week, to slip out of my bedroom window to meet up with my 16-year-old boyfriend, who lived in a house conveniently across the way. It was true, of course. That's exactly what I was doing. But how my parents knew about this, and what I was getting up to, was a mystery to me. I would willfully abandon my homework to spend some time at my boyfriend Larry Bowman's house, whose parents were very easygoing about my presence there, which certainly infuriated my parents, who thought my boyfriend's parents were completely irresponsible. I knew my schoolwork was suffering, and that one day I would likely go to medical school, but not if I didn't put in the work. I was naturally bright, but I was bone idle, and the teachers knew it, and so did I. I can't count the number of times I was lured into the headmistress's office to explain why my homework was not completed, and why I was doing so badly in school. "Explain yourself, Seraphina," said the headmistress to me, throwing my English composition book right at me. "Where's the essay you're supposed to have done about the day in the life of a Union soldier in the American Civil War?" She scans through the empty pages, and looks at me with her astute eyes. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Weaver, but I didn't have time to do it," I exclaim. "That's funny," said the headmistress. "Your mother informs me you're given plenty of time after school to complete your work. And on the subject of your grades, in the last few months, they've gone down the toilet. You've plunged from straight A's to C's, and that's a considerable drop, Seraphina. And I know you can do a lot better than that. Your mother believes you're bone idle. What do you have to say for yourself, young lady?" "I'm not bone idle, Mrs. Weaver. My mum's wrong. I work very hard," I lie. "Does this look like you're working hard, Seraphina?" says Mrs. Weaver, throwing my empty exercise book at me across the table. "If you carry on like this, young lady, I will have to retain you myself after school to complete your homework assignments under the supervision of one of the teachers. Do you understand that?" "Yes, Miss Weaver," I had said. My mother had threatened to send me to boarding school if my grades didn't improve. "If you don't get your act together, I won't have any choice in the matter. At boarding school they have supervised homework for you, so you'll be forced to buckle down and do some hard graft." "But I don't want to go to boarding school," I had protested. "Tough titty, you'll be going if your grades don't improve. I'm tired, Seraphina, of your apathetic indifference to your homework. And that dropout of a boyfriend of yours is an incredibly bad influence on you. Oh, goodness gracious, he's so dopey, so lackadaisical. I doubt he even knows what day of the week it is. And I don't doubt he doesn't know what on earth is going on in the world. He's like living in limbo. And as for his parents, they're like a couple of sloths who entertain themselves by hanging upside down all day, and only getting up to take the long, arduous journey to the refrigerator to retrieve an ice cream from the freezer cabinet, I don't doubt." "Why are you being so horrible about my boyfriend, Mummy? He's nice and his parents are nice too." My father intervenes on my mother's account, like he always does. "Your mother is not being horrible, young lady. She's being very patient with you. You want to become a doctor one day, do you not? But you're not going to get very far if you refuse to study. And your mother's right. Your boyfriend is not a good influence on you. And his parents should be very ashamed of their behaviour. They shouldn't allow you to hang around there all day, but they positively encourage it." Lazy bum, says my little brother Matthew, sticking his tongue out at me. "Mummy's going to send you to boarding school because you're a very bad girl. Mummy says you're a bad girl. Your boyfriend is a dopey sloth. Your boyfriend's a dopey sloth." Of course I hadn't believed it would happen, but here I was. I was surprised to find I enjoyed myself at the school, as I'd made some good friends there, who were so much less unruly than I was. They were well behaved and disciplined. When I saw the sign on the woodgrove saying "Danger, do not enter," I knew it was strategically placed there to warn off other kids from going exploring in there, as the teachers like to keep their beady eyes on the pupils, especially the untamed, unbridled ones like myself. I perceived it was the quintessential place you could possibly get away with smoking a pack of cigarettes, or even drinking a touch of alcohol, if it came into your possession. It seemed like the ideal opportunity of escapism for me, and the warning signs were like a welcome invite. I thoroughly enjoyed dicing with danger. It appealed to the venturesome, obstinate side of my character that rebelled against being told what to do. I had successfully persuaded, coaxed, and manipulated one of the more obliging day scholars to buy me some cigarettes, and she did, without the teachers knowing anything about it. I remember asking the girls about the keep-out sign, and why it was erected outside the woodgrove. There was one girl who shared a dorm with me called Mackenzie, who rarely overreacted when I briefly mentioned I wanted to go exploring the woodgrove. "You don't want to go in there," she said. "Why not?" I challenged her. "Let's just say there are bad things that happen in there." The one thing that people fail to realise about willful girls like myself is that saying something like that to me is not going to be a deterrent in any way. It gave me a driving desire to explore the woodland oasis. Of course I had been told about the ghost of Mrs. Lennox ambling down the school corridors at the dead of night, and knew it was all a hoax. "There's no such thing as ghosts," I informed my new friends. "My bet is that the matron, what's her name? The fat lady with the grey hair. Oh, Mrs. Goodwin, she made the whole thing up just to scare us, so that we will resist creeping around the place at night." one day armed with my brand new box of cigarettes. I knew that smoking them alone would be boring without a cooperative friend. I didn't even like smoking all that much, but the thought of doing something that could land you into heaps of trouble made life a whole lot more interesting. It gave me that quintessential buzz of adrenaline, rather like living on the edge. I'd managed to persuade one of the girls, Addison, to come into the woodgrove for a smoke. She looked at my cigarettes longingly. She came from a family of cigarette smokers, and from a young age she had breathed in the smoke and often smoked cigarettes herself. Her parents weren't bothered about that. I knew she would not be able to resist my offer. She was practically drooling when she saw my cigarettes. "All right, I'll come with you, but no one can see us." We slipped into the woodgrove together, when people were gathered around the oak tree for the usual peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. But one girl was having a birthday, so ice cream cake was also on offer that day. We knew the lure of ice cream would keep our friends conveniently distracted and so preoccupied, which meant we would be unlikely to be seen. I could see Addison was losing her cool. She was such a pathetic wimp. She was beginning to express doubt about this adventurous opportunity. "If anybody sees us, we could get into double trouble. I don't want to get into trouble." "No one saw us," I assure her gingerly. "There's ice cream being served up. No one will have given us a fleeting thought. They'll be far too distracted." "But what about the keep out danger sign? Supposing the woods really are dangerous?" "Addison, are you for real? Don't be such a wet blanket. I thought you had more guts than the other girls here. That's why I asked you to come with me," I told her. At that unexpected compliment, Addison looks rather pleased. "You think I've got guts?" she asks me. "Sure," I say. "You got guts, Addison. Not like the other dropouts at school who squeal if their hair is tangled. You're not like that. You're brave. That's why I handpicked you personally." In truth, I thought she had the courage of a jellyfish. She was so translucently pathetic. But I could see my flattering words had somehow inflated her confidence, and she eagerly followed me into the woods. What can I say? The woods literally took my breath away. I'm quite sure they have this effect on everyone. I almost forgot about the cigarettes we intended to smoke. I was so arrested by this enchanting, beguiling sanctuary. It was like finding a secret kingdom all of your own, within the grounds of the school. I knew without a shadow of a doubt I'd be coming back here again, with or without Addison. It was magical the way the light filtered through the canopy of the towering trees, buttering the ground in a shimmering glaze that made everything in the forest twinkle and sparkle radiantly, while the ground was bespeckled with the confetti of fallen leaves, intertwined with broken twigs and pebbles. There were delicate woodland flowers that had pushed through the ground to anoint the woodgrove in bursts of pretty colour, and in the distance I could hear the sound of a stream filtering through the valley, gushing over the rocks in a forceful frequency. "Let's go to the stream," I say exuberantly. The forest was filled with the pretty ebullient sound of birdsong. It was blissfully tranquil, so we immediately skirted down the hilly elevation to sit by the stream. We began to light up our cigarettes. Addison takes a big puff and blows out a stream of white smoke. I can see that she's an experienced smoker. "Whew, that's so good. My mother gets through 2 packs of these a day. She's a nervous wreck without them. Of course, she's been to the doctor hundreds of times. He tells her that if she doesn't quit smoking, she's going to end up with lung cancer. But my great-grandmother died at 97, and she didn't stop smoking until the very day she died. My mother told this to the doctor, but he said that it didn't mean that she would be the lucky one to live to 97. He couldn't count the number of times smokers had told him exactly the same story. Well, maybe your family's got good genes, I say. I don't understand why you smoke. If you want to be a doctor one day, Addison says to me. I mean, you've got to practice what you preach. It's like you can't tell a 500-pound woman to lose weight if you're 600 pounds yourself. I mean, that would be crazy. I suppose so, I say. But right now I'm having fun. I'll worry about all those details when I'm older. All of a sudden, Addison looks at me. Her eyes grow round. There's something watching us, she exclaims. There's a movement in that bush over there. It wobbled. Don't be ridiculous, I say. Is that your idea of a wind-up? No, it's not, says Addison, stabbing her cigarette into the ground and rising up to her feet, brushing the leafy bracken off her skirt. "I'm sorry. I'm getting the hell out of here. Something's watching us. Listen, everything's grown very quiet. I can't even hear the bird song anymore. That means a predator's around. My dad taught me that. I'm telling you, there's something there. I'm really scared. I want to get out of here now." I pick up a couple of stones and throw them at the bush to show my friend that there is nothing there and nothing to worry about. And then we see it. And boy, do we see it. Let's just say there are some things you see you wish you could unsee. And this is unequivocally one of those occasions. Both me and Addison observed this monstrous wolf-like humanoid, standing on 2 feet, like a man with blazing red eyes. It was furious with us, especially after I'd thrown stones at it. The only way I can describe this creature as quite literally the most grotesque, sinister being I've ever encountered. It was huge, powerful, bodeful. Me and my friends scream. We tear through the forest as fast as we can, shrieking at the top of our lungs, calling out for help. "Help! Help! Someone help!" I feel certain one of us is going to die. I don't doubt it. I know it. I've never felt so much fear escalate through my entire body, like a powerful steam engine on full throttle. This thing is right behind me. I can feel its breath, its hot breath, on the back of my neck. It smells like decaying flesh. It's repugnant. It's vile. The creature roars at us as it runs after us. It's touching me. And then we see Mrs. Goodwin. She stands there in the forest with a rifle in her hand, firing off rounds of bullets after the creature. The creature turns around and scurries away. Mrs. Goodwin had quite literally saved our lives, but she's not happy with us. Me and Addison are trembling so much. I literally wet myself. I can't help myself. I've never been this frightened. Mrs. Goodwin is shouting at us. "Did you not see the sign outside the woodgrove? It says, 'Danger, keep out.' Can't you read? What on earth were you doing in the woodgrove?" I was hardly going to admit we'd both been smoking, but if she'd got close to us, she would have smelt the evidence on our breaths, and that would have been dreadful. I don't want you telling the kids about what you think you saw. It'll give them nightmares. I think this woodgrove is its territory. It's a very dangerous creature. You're a very lucky lady, Seraphina, that Mackenzie here had your back. She's been keeping a beady eye on you. She said you'd been asking too many questions about the woodgrove. She knew you were up to something. She came to call me when she saw you breaking the rules. She was concerned for your safety. What do you have to say for yourself, young lady?" "I'm very sorry, Mrs. Goodwin. It won't happen again." "I should think so. You're lucky I got here in time." Let's just say after that grueling experience, I knew I was never going anywhere near that woodgrove. 10 months later, Melissa's account. That evening I finished my homework, under the supervision of Mrs. Goodwin in the dining hall. She watches over us from the furthest table, and once the clock registers 9 o'clock, we're free to go to our dormitories. When she told us that we could pack up and go, everyone bustled out of the dining hall as fast as they could. We retreated to our classrooms to put our books away in our desks. Finally, we made our way up the staircases, back to our dorms in single file. My dormitory was on the 4th floor, a floor above Mrs. Goodwin's suite, which is on the 3rd floor. We all got dressed in our PJs. We brushed our teeth, washed our faces, and finally returned to bed. We could hear Mrs. Goodwin padding up and down the corridors to switch off the dormitory lights. We always knew when she was coming, as the sound of her slippers were very distinctive, and as she was a slightly bigger woman, she was less light on her feet, so her movements were conspicuously much more pronounced. "It's lights out," she told us, scanning us all to check we were in bed, with her shrewd brown eyes that did not miss a beat. You could never underestimate that woman, as many did, as that woman was as discerning as a voucher. She was a no-nonsense lady, but with the heart of a lion. For many of us, the quintessential mother figure, when we were far away from home. You could literally talk to Mrs. Goodwin about anything. She was such a great listener. I knew that there was a story behind her life, as she had buried away herself in the boarding school, rather like a nun in a convent, as if she wanted to escape from the outside world. I'd heard her husband had died in a fortuitous accident, at 50 years of age or something like that, after falling off a roof at their home, but I was not sure if the story was actually true. I didn't care to ask. There are some prying things that my mother always taught me. You don't ask a person, even if you're bursting with curiosity. And this is one of those things. I had heard about the ghost, rumoured to haunt the school corridors at night, called Mrs. Priscilla Lennox, who was one of the original headmistresses of our school. I'd seen her picture hanging up in the corridor, and her painting gracing the wooden panels of the main hall. She was a woman that had dark hair, done in a typical Marilyn Monroe hairstyle that I believe was indicative of the time, and very dark piercing eyes. I was told that she'd been a tough taskmaster in her day, a formidable woman who didn't suffer fools gladly. I had thought her picture seemed quite sorrowful, actually, but that was just an instinct, rather than a confirmed knowledge. Some of the girls were afraid to go to the toilet at night unaccompanied. They were petrified of encountering the ghost of Mrs. Lennox, so it was not uncommon to prod someone wide awake so that you didn't have to make that journey all alone, even though there were toilets and showers on every dormitory block, only about 15 feet away from the main dormitory. It wasn't like you had to walk that far. I wasn't bothered about going to the toilet on my own at night, as I thought the ghost story was unlikely to be based on truth, and even if it was, I knew of no one who had physically seen the ghost. I will, of course, admit that there were times many of my friends reported an airy feeling when they went to the toilets, and a sense of foreboding that they weren't alone. Some even claimed to have heard the clip-clop of women's shoes. Let's just say I'd experienced the former, not the latter, but I thought it was a product of a highly active imagination, rather like a planted suggestion in your mind that you believe to be true, so much so that you're open to interpreting any random noises or impressions as potentially being the ghost of Mrs. Lennox. Personally, I thought the story was creative hogwash, possibly made up by Mrs. Goodwin herself, so that we wouldn't get up to mischief at night. Even my mother thought that this was likely to be the case. On this fateful night, Mrs. Goodwin looks in at us and pipes, "I don't want to hear any noise coming from this dormitory. Not like last night. Some of you were rather noisy." I slept in a bed an arm's distance from a girl called Colleen Joyner, who always wanted me to tickle her arm at night, which I found infuriating, but finally she relieved me of the tedious duty, and after a few whispers and giggles, we soon fell fast asleep. All of a sudden I wake up with the most dreadful pain in my stomach, unlike anything I've ever experienced before. Indeed, I was in such agonizing pain that I was literally clutching my belly. I don't honestly know why I didn't wake up any of my friends. That would have been a wise thing to do. I just thought I could get help from Mrs. Goodwin. I felt that I could still manage this pain, but I was wrong. I stagger down the passage like an inebriated drunk that can barely walk. I want to cry out. The pain is so intense that I'm holding on to my stomach tightly, struggling to actually breathe. I know I can't walk any further. I'm exhausted. I slump down against the wall, my feet sliding flat on the ground, sweat now pouring down my face. I'm breathing unsteadily. I feel as if I'm going to pass out and faint, as if all the energy has been sapped and ruthlessly expunged from my body. I know something is terribly wrong with me. I feel powerless to call anyone. I know that I'm never going to get to Mrs. Goodwin's sleeping quarters. I can't even walk down the corridor back to my own dormitory to get help. I'm never going to make it down a flight of steps to the 3rd floor. It's a particularly dark, tenebrous night. I see that as I glance through the wrought-iron balustrades that fringe the passageway and overlook views onto the school's rolling lawns. I can distinguish a few dusky silhouettes of trees, thanks to some permanent outside lights that remain on throughout the night. I'm sitting there, clutching my stomach. Then I hear a clip-clop of shoes. I sigh with relief, thinking someone is coming. But who? No one walks down the passageways at night with shoes that sound almost like a horse's hooves. Clip-clop, clip-clop, clip-clop. The feet are walking towards me. The sound is getting closer and closer and closer. I can hear the feet stopping within a couple of feet of me, and then there's silence, but nobody is there. But where I'm sitting is becoming increasingly chilly, as if I'm suddenly sitting in a refrigeration unit. I then get this airy feeling that someone is watching me. Could it be the ghost of Mrs. Lennox, I wonder? "Help me, Mrs. Lennox! I think I'm dying." I feel a bit silly, as no one is there, although it feels as if someone is standing right there, looking down at me. The footsteps seem to turn around, increase their pace, and dash away. At this point in time, I'm absolutely convinced that I've encountered the ghost of Priscilla Lennox. I felt her presence. I may not have physically seen her, but I really did feel her, and I inadvertently asked her for help. But can a ghost actually help me? This I seriously doubt. If someone doesn't get here soon, I could be found in the morning, lying dead in this passage. Barbara's account. I sleep in my dormitory on the 4th floor, and I wake up in my dreamy state to see a woman standing at the end of my bed. She seems familiar to me, but I can't work out where I've seen her before, as her hairstyle is quite old-fashioned. At first I think I must be dreaming. I rub my eyes, and I look at the woman. I look at her intently, thinking that this has got to be a weird dream. She indicates for me to follow her, but what is she doing in my dormitory? Why is she waking me up in the middle of the night like this? Who the heck is she? And why has our dormitory turned into a freezing refrigerator? I don't know who she is, but I decide to follow her, and that's when I see Melissa struggling to breathe, clutching her stomach, and groaning in the passageway, slumped against the wall. So my attention is immediately diverted from the woman. I look for her again, but she appears to have vanished. Where did she go? You'd think she'd lend a helping hand, rather than run off like that. Melissa's breathing is scarily shallow. She's sweating like a pig. Her eyes are rolling in the back of her head, and I shake her as hard as I can, but she's pretty unresponsive. "Melissa, what's wrong?" she grumbles, but I see she's clutching her stomach. I'm beginning to wonder if she's having issues with an appendix. I suddenly freak out, as if the weight of the world is on my shoulders, because if I don't get help for Melissa in time, she might surely die. Propelled by a sense of urgency, I shoot like a rocket down the stairs, hammering loudly on Mrs. Goodwin's door, and shouting at the top of my voice, "Mrs. Goodwin, something's wrong with Melissa! Call an ambulance! An ambulance now!" Mrs. Goodwin runs to the door, opening it abruptly. She's standing there in her pyjamas, with a cell phone in her hand, her fingers trembling, her sleeping eyes bouncing out of her slumber, while her face is drained of all its colour. "What's wrong with Melissa?" she asks me. "It's not good, Mrs. Goodwin. She looks like she's dying. I think it's her stomach. It might be an appendix." Mrs. Goodwin calls the emergency services at once, and then she races up to the 4th floor with me to attend to Melissa, who is so consumed by her pain, she's barely conscious. It's like she's confused, disorientated. Her heart is pounding so fast. The EMTs arrive and efficiently put her on a drip, rushing her to hospital. I was so relieved. I felt as if now she was in good hands. I asked around about the strange woman I'd seen. "Who was she?" says Hilda, a friend of mine. "I saw her standing at the edge of the corridor when the ambulance arrived, and then she disappeared. But she was watching everything. But when I looked up again, she was gone." It was only a day later, when I was in the hall during assembly, and my eyes glanced over to the picture which I had shown to Hilda. We both realised we'd seen the ghost of Priscilla Lennox, the original founder of our school, who'd woken me up to alert me to the fact that Melissa was in trouble. Suffice to say that Melissa was diagnosed with a sepsis caused by a viral infection. She was ventilated, given IV fluids, fluid replacement, along with a vasoconstrictor, antibiotics and steroids, and soon made a swift recovery and returned to school. But if I hadn't discovered her that night, the doctors say she would definitely have died. We were to discover that although Melissa never physically saw the ghost of Priscilla Lennox, she sensed the woman's presence and believes the ghost had alerted me to the fact that Melissa was in trouble. So yes, our school holds within its very foundations many mysterious secrets. So there you are. These are our incredulous stories.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was a very hot evening in North Carolina. The temperature was like a soaring, scorching 400-degree oven, cooking nothing but hot air. Juliet Silverton sat on her wraparound porch, wearing a pair of scruffy denim jeans, with holes in the knees and pockets, that might have looked intentionally fashionable, but they certainly weren't. Some people paid good money for funky jeans like this. Yet the reality was the holes in the fabric were from genuine wear and tear, when the denim fabric had some rough interactions with thorny briars and barbs, which had lashed out at the fabric angrily, tearing it to shreds. The rich earthen soil clung to her clothes in dark patches, resembling dark brown splatters of paint. The uninvited dirt seemingly lodged itself on the inside of her fingernails, rather unelegantly.
Juliet would love to have had pretty fingernails, but industrious yard work and a glossy pink manicure did not go hand in hand. Juliet's honey blonde shoulder-length hair was dampened by the humid heat that clung to her head in cloying limp ringlets, which gave you the misleading impression she had been for a quick dip in the swimming pool. She wiped the perspiration that had gathered on her forehead away with the back of her arm, while what remained of her mascara had simply melted away from the torrid summer day. She did wonder, would there be any end in sight from this unforgiving, relentless tropical heat that had doggedly plagued her life of late? The earth was crying out for rain. The flowers in the field were wilting under the long stretch of summer days, audaciously dictated by sweltering temperatures like a grueling, formidable taskmaster that brought no relief. Indeed, this inauspicious year in North Carolina, the fervid weather was cruel, punishing, contemptuous, the kind of uncongenial, unwelcome friend you would gladly throw out of the house with the bathwater if given the chance. It was as if the winter had simply ignored spring and hurried towards summer without stopping to even draw breath. Juliet Silverton hated the roasting heat with a fervent passion, but her ice-cold glass of homemade lemonade was cooling her down considerably and offering her a momentary relief, and the sweetness of the sugar gave her a quick buzz of much-needed energy, as she felt as deflated as a punctured beach ball and as worn out as a very well-beaten football that had been kicked far too many times. She pondered how the baking heat could suck you dry like nothing else she knew, bringing on feelings of sluggish exhaustion. It was so much easier to be productive in cold weather, she thought. Juliet's floppy white straw summer hat lay on a table beside the rocking chair that had once belonged to her husband's mother. She thoroughly enjoyed rocking in the chair, while overlooking the idyllic, enchanting views over the silvery pond that was graced by hundreds of leafy umbrellas and ethereal-looking pink flowers of the water-lily plants that she loved so much, while the weeping, graceful boughs of the willows elegantly cascaded over the water like viridescent feather boas. On many occasions she had been privy to seeing deers and raccoons coming to the water's edge for a quick drink, and would watch them for hours on end as the sun began to set over the valley, painting the sky into an undulating sea of pinks, golds, tangerines and yellows. The sunsets in this part of the world were quite something to behold. Juliet could hear her son Emmett in the front yard, pounding the basketball on the concrete slab, followed by the sound of an unfamiliar truck rolling up the driveway. That was when her son stopped throwing loops and came darting back into the house. 10-year-old Emmett was rather reticent around strangers, or people he was not well acquainted with, which naturally made him retreat into his shell like a tortoise. He was a lot like her late husband in this regard, quite unassuming and self-effacing. Juliet sighed. The last thing in the world she wanted was a visitor right now. Please, God, don't let it be Mrs. Doris Bridshaw. Not again. Not today. Juliet could not bear listening to Doris prattle on and on all the time, like a fishwife about everything and nothing. Doris had firmly decided, after Juliet's husband had died of prostate cancer not too long ago, and had been fortuitously widowed, that it was her Christian duty and responsibility to pay Juliet lots of visits and bring along some of her famous Boston cream pies. Juliet suspected that the woman wanted someone to talk at rather than to, as when Doris visited her, she never got a word in edgeways. It was hardly surprising, Juliet secretly surmised, that Doris's husband never said boo to a goose. He was such a quiet, unassuming man. He must have got used to his voice being confiscated by his garrulous wife. Juliet had secretly thought, if you put a gilded cage around Doris, she'd morph into a very annoying parrot. She always wore the brightest clothes, so when you looked at her, you needed to be wearing a dark pair of glasses. The glare could be blindingly obtrusive, as there was nothing restrained, subtle or subdued about Doris. She was a woman that wanted to be the centre of attention, and almost demanded it. Juliet reluctantly raises herself to her feet, pushing herself off the rocking chair. Every part of her body is aching from the back-breaking, gruelling work she'd been doing earlier in the yard, in clearing some of the paths in the wood. She edges her way to the door, her son following closely behind her, like an obedient lapdog that doesn't want to be parted from its owner. A gold Alfa Romeo convertible swings into her driveway, pulling up beside the basketball net, and Juliet realizes she doesn't recognize this car or the stranger in the front seat. The man remains seated in his car for quite a while. He finally climbs out, slamming the door behind him, all 6'3" of him, that is, with what seems like a reluctant hesitancy. Juliet decided he must be lost. He was possibly going to ask for directions. This would not be the first time people were lost in her part of the world, nor would it be the last. The man tosses his dark black hair, short on the sides and long on the top. He has an olive skin and hazel eyes, with shadows of darker and light gold tones that give him a gentle, almost endearing look. "Can I help you?" asked Juliet. "Are you lost?"
"I'm sorry to drop on you unannounced, but I didn't have your cell phone number, so I thought I'd pop in to see you myself, on the off chance you might be willing to spare me a little bit of your time. My name is Clyde Parkington," he says, offering Juliet a firm handshake.
"I'm Juliet," she says, reluctantly taking his hand in hers, all too well aware of the fact that her hands are a little filthy from all the yard work she'd been doing earlier on. If she had known someone would pop around spontaneously like this, she'd have given her nails a jolly good scrub. She feels quite self-conscious about her grubby state. Still, it can't be helped. She'd better invite the stranger in, she thinks. He looks as hot and bothered as some of the deflated flowers in her field. "You must excuse my dishevelled appearance," she says. "I've been working in the yard all day. I'm so fatigued, far too tired to change, as the broiling heat completely debilitates me. You're welcome to come in," she says. "I can offer you a lemonade, a glass of white wine, or a gin and tonic."
"A lemonade would be great. That would be most kind of you. Alcohol always makes me very sleepy, and I'm driving, so I will stay clear of that if I may."
The man follows Juliet onto her wraparound porch and stares out in awe at the countryside from beyond the patio and the silvery pond.
"You designed this yard yourself?" he says almost dreamily. "I love your pond. It's exquisite. It's like something you would expect to see out of a gardening catalogue. I'm very impressed."
"Oh, please," says Juliet modestly, flushing a shade of fuchsia from the unexpected compliment. "That's very kind of you to say. That's right, I did design the yard, if you can call it that." She hands Clyde a large glass of ice-cold lemonade that jiggles with ice cubes, which he takes from her gratefully, as this heat leaves most people feeling very parched.
"Ah, this is so good," he says, taking a sip. "I've never known the weather to be this ardently hot. This is very refreshing. Just what the doctor ordered."
"So may I ask you, Mr. Parkington, why you've come to see me today? I've never seen you around town before."
"That would be right. You wouldn't have seen me around town. I'm not from this part of the world. I'm from Boise in Idaho. Believe it or not, I recently learnt a whole lot about you. I attended church last Sunday. I had to find out who it was who landscaped the churchyard. I was given your name there by the church warden, a Mr. Terence Trevelli, who told me you designed the yard for them. I would be very pleased if you would landscape my property for me. I love the way you have done the churchyard. Your borders are controlled, but wild at the same time, where the wildness of the flowers tangle together in tumbling clusters that speak to me of yards written about by the great poets of yesteryear. Your plants are balanced in height and colour, and look natural and chaotic at the very same time. I think they call it organised chaos, and I love that look. It's unique, it's individual, immersed with structure like you would expect to find in the Garden of Eden, I imagine, as if nature herself has designed the garden. And yet in truth it is the work of a great artist, of a master gardener. It's an understated natural elegance that I like very much indeed."
"Look, that's very nice of you to say, Mr. Parkington. I'm very flattered, and I really appreciate your offer. I'm not a landscape gardener by any manner of means.
I only got the job at the churchyard when the pastor popped over to my house after my husband died to offer me some comfort. Let's just say that, like you, he loved the look of my yard and asked if I'd be interested in doing the churchyard for him. At the time I was grateful for some extra money and to keep myself busy and distracted during a time when the grief was unbearable for me. I found doing the yard work helped me to come to terms with my grievous loss. It brought me comfort and solace, kept me busy. I'm not a professional, but I do know an excellent landscape gardener that I can really recommend to you." Clyde Parkington grimaced. He ran his large hand through his thick black mane of hair down the central panel of his head. "Look, Juliet, I'll cut to the chase. I hope you don't mind me calling you by your first name. I don't want any old landscape gardener to do my yard. They're to a penny, very predictable. I'm bored with the bog-standard landscape designs out there. They're lacking in that artistic gift you've clearly got. I want someone who has a natural flair in making a yard look like a perfect flowery meadow, as if God himself designed it. I love your work. It's inspirational. It's art. But without it being obvious, that is. I want that for my yard, and I will pay you what it takes for you to do the job. How about $60,000 for starters, and with 3 fully paid workers to do all the hard work for you, so that they can do the back-busting chores, while you play the role of the conductor who makes the music happen, if you get my drift?" Juliet almost gasped in astonishment. $60,000. That was not money to be sneezed at. It could buy her a brand new truck, a trip on a cruise liner even. $60,000, she pipes. "Are you being serious?" "Of course I'm being serious. You can work at your own time, but the sooner you start on the job, the better. The house is now being completed. I'm looking forward to moving into the place, but only when the property is completed. I'm leaving Idaho and moving here to North Carolina. Before you ask, I'm not married, nor do I have children. I devoted my early life to running a software company, which I sold recently, so I'm retiring early, at the grand old age of 50. It was always my plan to retire young, so that I could travel, play golf, devote my spare time to my pottery. So it's just the yard that needs tending to, and planning, with your ingenuous flamboyant flair. I think I should warn you that the builders working on the property claimed that there were some kind of, well, paranormal activity going on at the house. The irony is those builders had not believed in ghosts before they worked on my property, but now they most certainly do, after the strange events that transpired during the building project. They were claiming they were being poked in the ribs and having their hair pulled at times. They could sometimes hear children laughing and tiny feet running all over the place. It alarmed them quite a bit, but they sensed it was just spirit children messing with them, so they never felt they were in danger. But to be fair to them, they completed the job. I'm sure lesser men would have abandoned the job in a heartbeat, so they were excellent workers. The house looks outstanding, I'm pleased to report.
"How interesting," says Juliet. "I've never visited a place that was haunted before. It could be quite eye-opening for me. I mean, I've watched some of those paranormal programs on television, of course, but I've never been privy to experiencing anything outer-worldly before."
"Well, to be fair," says Mr. Parkington, "I've been around that house multiple times myself, and I've seen and heard nothing. So I'm slightly cynical of the builder's claims, I have to say. I find it hard to get my head around stuff like that. I can't help wondering if someone left a radio on or something."
"If you don't mind my saying, if that were the case, how do you explain the poking of the ribs, the hair being pulled, the little children's laughter, the running around the place? That doesn't sound like a trick to me. That sounds paranormal."
"One of the builders could possibly be playing a trick on the others. That's what I sometimes think,"
says Mr. Parkington, taking a sip of lemonade. "Really? You do surprise me," says Julia, raising a quizzical eyebrow. "I doubt that somehow. Does the house have a history by any chance? You often find old houses can sometimes have a reputation for being haunted. My father used to say that houses are like sponges. They absorb the history of a place, especially if something traumatic happened there. It can be replayed back in our time.
There is, as it happens. I mean, it's an old colonial house. Lots of history about it. And there is a story connected to the house. The wife, a woman called Isadora Holden, was the lady of the house. They hired a young Irish lady's maid called Tilly, who would help Isadora get dressed and would brush her long dark hair. You know, all the duties of a lady's maid. It seemed that Tilly fell pregnant after a clandestine affair with Isadora's husband, who was claimed to have a bit of a roving eye at the time. When the wife learnt the young girl had betrayed her trust, she was utterly mortified, and the horrifying news that Tilly was 7 months pregnant with her husband's baby made her incandescent with rage. I can't say I blame her. One of her close members of staff informed her about the relationship that had been occurring under her roof. She was outraged by Tilly's duplicity, but also gravely humiliated about the shame it would bring upon her family name if anyone was to learn about the pregnancy beyond her home, as family honour was very big in those days, and a soiled reputation brought with it bountiful shame. For Isadora there were deeper issues at stake. Beyond that, I have to say, as 2 of her children have died of smallpox. A boy called Augustus, he was 8 years old, and a young girl, Henrietta, who was 7. She was furiously jealous that this presumptuous little madam, a little lady's maid, had beguiled her husband, and would soon be giving birth to her husband's baby. Isabella was barren, and could not birth any more children. So she pushed Tilly down the stairs, in a spontaneous, unplanned burst of jealous rage. I mean, the poor woman had lost 2 of her own children, and now her lady's maid Tilly was having her husband's 3rd child. After being pushed down the staircase, the young woman went into contractions. She delivered a premature baby that died soon after birth, as in those days they didn't cope with premature births like we do today, and many babies just died when they were born too early. Little Tilly was broken-hearted about her baby's unheralded death, which was made significantly worse by the fact that Isadora's husband no longer paid Tilly any special attention. She was found hanging from the inside of the closet in Isadora's bedroom. The woman apparently screamed her lungs out to discover little Tilly hanging there. I imagine she knew she was responsible for the young girl's death, and was plagued with a dreadful guilt.
And you moved into the house knowing all this? You're a brave man, Mr. Clyde Parkington. And in truth, I don't know whether that's a compliment or an insult. You see, I'm quite sure buying a house with a history like that would leave me running for the hills.
Well, I haven't moved into the house yet, says Clyde, laughing at Juliet's reaction. I admit the estate agent warned me the house was reputed to being haunted, but I don't take much notice of things like that. Well, I didn't, until the builders started to report the bizarre incidents that gave me pause for reflection. But as I keep telling you, I've stayed over the place numerous times. The house is fully furnished now. I found a very good interior designer, who's good with 17th to 18th century furnishings. I hasten to say, I never saw anything untoward going on in the house. I never heard little children giggling, nor did I have my hair pulled.
Are you telling me you weren't just a teensy-weensy bit bothered by what the builders and estate agent actually told you? As I was saying, if the boot were on the other foot, I wouldn't move into the house with that kind of history. It would bother me very much if someone was rumoured to have hung themselves in the house. Please don't tell me you're going to move into that bedroom, where Tilly the lady's maid was found hanging.
I am, as it happens, but stuff like that doesn't bother me. I mean, it happened an awfully long time ago. And even if ghosts are real, they can't exactly hurt you, can they?
I'm not so sure about that. And let's just say it's not exactly true. I've heard that violent hauntings can actually hurt you. People have been attacked by ghosts before, you know, flung down staircases, actually hit and punched. Don't you believe that houses absorb the energy of the people that lived there once before?
So if something bad transpired in your house, surely it's left an impression. I'm not sure if I believe in all that. Now let's just change the subject, shall we? I've got the key for the house, which you will need to use for your convenience whenever necessary. Like using the toilets, washing your hands, keeping your food refrigerated, making coffee. Feel free to have a shower there any time you desire. I won't be around, but as I say, make yourself at home. You can use the downstairs office for any phone calls you might wish to make to various suppliers. If you need to take a nap on any of the beds upstairs, you're welcome. I realize the heat can be insufferable at this time of the year, so you are welcome to take as many naps as you like.
Thank you, I do appreciate that. I do like to take cat naps in weather like this, so you're speaking my language. You don't want me to draw up any plans for your yard to show you first?
Absolutely not. I want you to feel the place. Follow your natural instincts about what you want to do to the yard. Give me a call if you need anything. Just order any of the yard materials and plants that you need from the Fairview Garden Centre. I have an account with them there, and they will deliver to my address personally.
Juliet's account. What had I done? I wasn't exactly sure. I'd agreed to do some yard work for a respectable, rather charming gentleman by the name of Clyde Parkington, whom had popped into my life unexpectedly, like an unusual perennial in the meadow, that I couldn't actually identify. He was an interesting man, rather an idiosyncratic character, whom had never been married before, and was retiring at 50 years old, after having sold off his software company, and now he was choosing to settle in North Carolina for a change of scene. Don't get me wrong, but if I was retiring, I would be more inclined to buy a place by the coast. But each to his own, I suppose. This eminent man, whom had breezed through my life like an unexpected, welcome, cool easterly wind, wanted to pay me $60,000 to inject my artistic touches into his yard. I was flattered he liked my work. I've always thoroughly enjoyed being omnific and inventive in the yard, and suffusing flamboyant colours into the landscape, almost as if the land itself has purged these flowers naturally through the earth, without it seeming obvious that a human was involved in this natural sequence of events. I must confess, admitting that the builders had been experiencing paranormal activity on the property left me feeling, well, let's just say rather curious. But I doubted I would be privy to any ghostly interactions myself, as I imagined ghosts possibly only haunted the hallways at night, when I was unlikely to be on the property at the time. Suffice to say, I rarely needed the money, and so procuring an extra $60,000 was not money I could afford to actually turn away. I was hardly going to look a gift horse in the mouth. That would be a foolish thing to do. I had little Emmett, my 10-year-old son, to consider. "You're going to make Mr. Parkington's yard look nice, Mummy. Like ours. You're going to make his look like ours." "That's right, sweetheart. I am." When I married my husband, I'd only just graduated from college. I'd never ever taken a job a day in my life. But if there was anything I did know my stuff about, it was gardens, as flowers and plants and trees had always been a passion for me. I think I found I could express my creativity in the yard. Suffice to say, news gets around rather fast in a small town, and as can be expected, when Mrs. Doris Bridgeshaw learnt that I was going to plan the yard for Mr. Parkington's home, she became incredibly animated. I was surprised she knew about the history of the old colonial house, but then why was I surprised? In truth, what did Mrs. Doris Bridgeshaw not know about people's lives? She was like a ferret, putting her nose into everybody's business. I remember she came running into my house in a bright emerald green dress that was weighted down by an excess of heavy beads. On this occasion she sauntered into my house like a bright green frenzied cyclone, catching me completely off guard, as on this occasion she'd forgotten to knock on my door. It was once again an insufferable hot day, and Mrs. Bridgeshaw was fanning herself with a Chinese fan. At the time I was squeezing lemons and stirring a pot of sugar syrup on the range oven to make more homemade lemonade. I looked up in surprise to see Mrs. Bridgeshaw staring at me with enthusiastic eyes. "Well, tell me, is it true? Is it true?" "Is what true?" I ask. "That you're going to be doing the yard work on the Rochester property. You know, that old colonial house that's been fixed up recently?" "How do you know about that?" I asked incredulously. "Well, I have my sources. Of course I know what goes on around here."
So it is true, then? It's true, I said. The kettle's just boiled. Would you like some tea? If you're having some, that would be fabulous. I wouldn't go there if you paid me $1 million, she informed me, her fingers trembling excitedly as she began shaking the teacup in her hand and almost spilling it all over my kitchen countertop. I retrieved some toweling paper to dab up the mess. You don't know about the history of the house, do you? She lowers her voice to a faint whisper. You do know. The place is supposed to be haunted. I'm well aware of that. Mrs. Bridshaw's eyes grow as wide as saucers. Someone hung themselves in that house. I think it was the lady's maid. I heard about that too. I believe her name was Tilly, the lady's maid, I mean. Do you know why the Rochesters actually sold that house? Do you know the real reason? I'm guessing because it was haunted. Worse than that, they'd be awoken to a woman's screams in the middle of the night. They say it was the sound of the lady of the house, called Isadora. She was screaming when she discovered her lady's maid hanging from inside the closet. It's quite some story, isn't it? Aren't you bothered to be going there? To be working there? No, I need the money. I enjoy working with plants, and I imagine most ghostly activity happens during the night. Although what? Asks Mrs. Bridshaw. Well, as it happens, Mr. Parkington did say the builders complained during daytime hours of being jabbed in the ribs by little hands, having their hair pulled, and hearing children laughing. But nothing bad happened. It was all just harmless. Well, good for you, Juliet. You're a lot braver than me. Promise me this, though. If anything weird, outer-worldly happens in the house, you will let me know about it. Of course, I say. I wouldn't dare not tell you. And so began the gardening project for Mr. Parkington's property. The first time I laid my eyes on the house, for a brief moment, I felt almost as if I'd been transported back to another time in our history. I almost felt out of place standing there, in my scruffy jeans and floppy hat. I felt way too underdressed, as if I should be wearing a fabulously ornate gown. I had arrived at the property on this occasion to walk around, to get a feel for the place, to contemplate on what I could do to transform the yard. I parked my car on the semicircular driveway there, which was the only flat area around the house. I just stood there staring at the very charming house, like a large sea sponge, just soaking it all in. This imposing, spectacular mansion had a restrained but stately elegance about it, with white walls, black shutters, large windows. But although it seemed settled on its foundations, that had rooted themselves into the soil, there was a sad energy to the home that I picked up almost immediately, as if the house was basking in its own melancholia. I glanced up at a window, certain I'd seen a movement. It was as if I'd seen a face staring down at me. It was so fleeting, so quick, that I was convinced I'd imagined it. When I pinned my eyes onto the window in question, there was nothing there. Of course, I told myself it was just a trick of the light. The sunshine that day was unrelenting, as it had been all summer, viciously pounding through the skies, with a bright glaring light, and a heat so torrid, so hot, that I was beginning to sweat, and it was still so early in the morning. I glanced around at the surrounding transfixing views, and that's when I appreciate why Mr. Parkington bought this property. It was not so much the house that had tickled his fancy, I don't believe. It was the arresting countryside that surrounded it. The house itself was parked, like a grand ocean liner, in the middle of an enchanting valley, surrounded by the impassionate fury of the billowing ocean waves. In this case, the waves were rolling hills that danced around the house in sumptuous meadows of verdant grass and pretty flowers. The house was fringed by large clusters of trees that stretched up into a steep elevation. In the furthest distance, the skyline was plundered by the majestic contours of the mountains that seized your attention and demanded your respect. In the morning light, their voluptuous silhouettes seemed to melt like chocolate into a purple blue-like haze. I found my heart fluttering with excitement as I thought about how I would clear out the undershrubbery in the woodgrove and invite some shade-loving plants and flowers to occupy that gorgeous space. How I would bring wild indigenous flowers to impregnate the landscape with vibrant, rich colours.
while I would invite the naked walls of the house to embrace the tumbles of pretty climbing roses, along with purple wisteria, so that the house could wear a scarf around her neck, in a tangled confetti of colour. It was poetry in the making. Mr. Parkington had been true to his word, and help had been recruited on my behalf to help me with some of the back-breaking work, while the nursery gallantly delivered all the plants and materials I needed for the job on hand. One day, when the oppressive North Carolina heat was so insufferable, it had almost seared through my clothes like a hot oven, I knew I needed to seek refuge in the house just to cool down. The fatigued, burnt-out workers had already left for the day. Fortunately, my son was staying overnight at his best friend's house, and I was frankly too jaded to actually go home. I decided I'd have a quick cat nap in one of the bedrooms, and then once I was physically revived and restored, I would drive home. I chose a well-appointed, attractive, air-conditioned bedroom with a queen-size bed. I pulled the curtains close to darken the room, and I crashed out on the bed. Imagine my surprise to wake up in the middle of the night in a strange house. Where was I? I sat up with a start, glancing at my cell phone, feeling rather confused and disorientated. I could not comprehend what I was doing in Mr. Parkington's house, lying on one of his beds. It seemed rather strange to me, and then I remembered that I'd taken a brief cat nap and clearly fallen asleep. I glanced briefly at my cell phone. It was 10 o'clock at night. Are you kidding me? The bed I'd been lying in was so cool, and the sleep I'd enjoyed was better than I'd experienced in a long time. And as my son was staying at his friend's house, I had no responsibilities, so I decided I'd stay overnight at Mr. Parkington's property. It was frankly far too much effort to make the journey home. I had a packed lunch that I'd failed to eat during the day because it was just too hot, so I ambled down to the kitchen and grabbed my lunchbox while I made myself a quick cup of coffee. That was when I heard the giggles and feet running around the upper landing, and I knew no one was there. Then I heard the sound of a tennis ball bouncing up and down. It was flying down the sweeping staircase and then rolling into the kitchen, but no one was there. My hair began to stand on edge. It seemed so surreal. "Hello," I called, picking up the ball. "Is anyone there?" But I was met with silence. You would think at this point I would hightail it out of Mr. Parkington's house, get into my truck, and return home faster than a March hare. But I was too exhausted to actually care. I told myself it was probably the spirit children that the builders had encountered, but they were harmless enough. Why should I worry? I retreated to my bedroom, feeling slightly more apprehensive. Let's just say my shattered state had somewhat hijacked my cognitive ability to reason or to make sense of these outer-worldly occurrences. I returned to the bedroom and swiftly fell fast asleep. I can't remember a time when I was more exhausted. I awoke with a start to the sound of these ear-piercing shrill screams later on in the night that were so discomposing, so disturbing, they could have shattered glass. It was the most terrifying noise that even my mug of coffee on the side table next to the bed began to rattle under its vibration. It was a murderous, disembodied-like scream. If I hadn't known about the history of the house, I would have thought someone was being murdered, not too far away from me. My heart began to pound violently in my chest at 1,000 miles an hour. A cold chill ran down my spine, while every hair on the back of my neck was standing up on edge. Was that the scream of Isadora when she discovered the lady's maid hanging in the closet? I don't know what on earth possessed me. Let's just say, brave is not exactly my middle name, and courage is not something that has ever ingratiated itself towards my personality. But I unhesitantly, unflinchingly dashed towards the furthest room in the house that in the cold light of day I had been grudgingly opposed to visit, as this was the ill-fated, infelicious room where the lady's maid Tilly was fortuitously found hanging in the closet. I had been far too anxious to go in there, but an irrational, illogical courage overcame me, and cautiously I opened the door of the main bedroom. It's cold as ice as the freezing air blasts at my neck, but there's no air conditioning in this room, which should have been muggy, given the stifling conditions outside. The room feels airily spooky. I get the overwhelming sense that I'm being watched. There's no wind in the room, but the long sweeping curtains are literally rocking backwards and forwards on the curtain rails without any antagonist. The closet door is wide open. The door is swinging on its hinges, making an ominous, unsettling squeaking sound that rather reminds me of white chalk on a teacher's classroom board when it scratches the surface. I quickly close the closet door, cringing as the thought that this is possibly the pretentious, direful location where Tilly's hanging body was recovered. I suddenly hear a muffled woman's sob, and feet scurrying past me quickly, like a fast-moving wind. I feel the vibration and hear the sound of flat women's shoes as they scurry down the staircase at a speed that shocks even me. And for a brief, fleeting second, I get a glimpse of a woman's profile as I glance down at the staircase. It is rather like looking at a faded photograph of a woman in 1800s clothes, although her profile appears very real. I notice the figure is quite translucent, as I can see directly through her, yet I can still see her quite clearly. The woman turns around and briefly looks at me. She hurries out of the house. For some irrational, implausible reason, I so want to comfort her, for in that moment, in the woman's dark eyes, I had sensed a dreadful, sorrowful grief. I quickly put on my boots that I'd left by the front door, grabbing a torch that has conveniently been left on the hall table, like an unlikely blessing. I open the front door and hurriedly find myself running after the woman. There are moments when her body becomes solid, as if she's as real as you or me. "Hold on! Hold on!" I call after her. I had in mind that I'd talk to her about what had transpired in the house all those years ago, as I hoped that she might be able to forgive herself for what had happened to Tilly. I knew the events that had occurred were ultimately a consequence of a husband's adulterous behaviour, a wife's grief in losing her children to smallpox, and the lady's maid Tilly, who had betrayed her trust. I was hoping a few words might help her to see that pushing Tilly down the staircase was wrong, but it was no more wrong than Tilly's affair with her husband, and her husband's cheating behaviour. I wanted this poor woman to forgive herself for what had transpired. A sudden impulsive rush of anger had pushed her lady's maid down the stairs, which had resulted in a premature baby dying soon after its birth, and Tilly taking her own life. Now the poor woman was cocooned in the despair of her self-condemnation. "Stop! Please stop! Can I have a word? Just a brief word? Please, please don't go!" I'll never forget that night. It was almost as muggy as the day had been. There were mosquitoes buzzing around, trying to bite me, but I didn't care. The moonlight was so pretty tonight, generous in her vibrancy, as she caressed the rolling countryside magnanimously with a luminescent silvery glaze that was ethereal, very fetching, reducing the daunting demeanour of the billowing terrain that can so easily trip you up in the darkness, as the ground here is not exactly flat. The silvery stars boldly danced from the canopy of the sky, shining as brightly as twinkling diamonds. I am clumsily manhandling the torch and flickering its beams all over the place. It seems nonsensical to be following a ghost for inexplicable reasons even I can't fathom. By all accounts, I'd never consider running into the woodgrove during the night like this, especially not after something or someone that has long since passed away. So what the hell is wrong with me? I'm driven by an audacious determination that does not belong to me, almost as if I'm wearing a piece of borrowed clothing that I'm not entirely comfortable in, as it doesn't exactly fit me. The vague hazy silhouettes of the tall vertical trees that plunder the skyline, in a regal elegance, seem to morph into dark sultry beings under the cover of darkness. It's what you don't see that is the most intimidating, as anything could be loitering in the dark shadows. And for me, that is the most discomposing feeling. Suffice to say, I enter the woodgrove, my torchlight swinging to the left and right. I try to look for the ghostly apparition, and then something gets my attention that astonishes me so much that to this day I'm still inclined to say, "What the hell?" Let's just say, of all the most unlikely, incongruous things to ever happen to a person, it happened to me. I hear a sound. I move towards it instinctively. Then standing before me, larger than life, is a Herculean-sized male Bigfoot. This I did not expect to see. Not at all. Indeed, you don't ever expect to see something that you don't actually believe exists. But there he was, standing before me, with a magisterial grace that was reverential and imposing. I certainly perceived that he did want to be seen by me. He wasn't trying to hide, nor was he evasive or reticent, but very clearly desirous to engage my full attention. He stood there for a long while, like a lamppost on a street corner, as if he was helping me to assimilate him in all his lofty, towery majesty. I was too shocked and befuddled to even recruit any fear. It was like I was immersed in a wild, fantabulous dream, almost like Alice in Wonderland, that had no bearing with reality whatsoever. So it just can't be true, can it? Yet I'm enjoying the peculiarity of my dream, its lucid, bizarre details. Part of me does not want to wake up, but I feel I must, so I rub my eyes vigorously. But I'm still standing here in the forest, staring at a male Bigfoot. The creature is different to the Patterson footage I'd seen years before. For a start, this creature is much taller, much wider, with a taut muscle definition that would certainly be the envy of any aspiring bodybuilder. His Titanic-sized shoulders would make an NFL quarterback's shoulders look ridiculously inconspicuous and possibly even puny. He's covered in sweeping dark long hair, the colour of a raven's feather, and although it caresses his body, it is not patchy, but thick and luxuriant. His face is so startlingly human, his demeanour almost angelic. He has golden eyes that are incredibly kind. I notice he has overlong arms that taper down to beyond his knees. Then I hear in my head very articulate words that are commanding in their authority and persuasively influential. "We've been waiting for you. I'm very glad you've come. She needs your help. Come with me now." The voice that's speaking into my head is not mine. It's husky, masculine, deep, low. I look up in the creature's face and realize he's spoken directly to my mind. Is this how someone speaks to you telepathically, I wonder? The creature's indicating for me to follow him. I don't hesitate. Once again, I feel like invisible hands are guiding me, propelling me ever forwards. The creature points towards the apparition, who's sitting on the ground sobbing. She doesn't look translucent. She looks as solid as a regular human being, only she's wearing a Victorian bustle skirt with a buttoned bodice. I notice 2 ghostly children are standing between the trees next to the Bigfoot, watching their mother, who doesn't appear to see them or even acknowledge that they're there. I have the sense that they've been trying to get her attention for a very, very long time. But she's so ensnared and entrenched in her grief and self-recrimination, and even her guilt has suctioned out all her joy. She doesn't notice them. "Speak to her." The Bigfoot's voice enters my head again. "She needs your help. She needs to go to the light." "Hello, Isadora," I say. "You don't know me. You see, I'm from another time, the 20th century, actually, to be exact. My name is Juliet. I heard all about your sad story. I understand you blame yourself for pushing Tilly down the stairs in a moment of mad, impassionate anger. Let me say this. Your husband cheated on you, Isadora. Your lady's maid, Tilly, betrayed you. Yes, you reacted badly to what happened all those years ago. I would have been mad as hell if that had happened to me. And you had every reason to be aggrieved. But all of you did something wrong. You don't have a monopoly on guilt here. If your husband and lady's maid had behaved themselves in the first place, none of this would ever have transpired. It was like a pack of cards that was naturally waiting to fall down. Tilly might have taken her own life, but if she had not fallen pregnant, none of this would have happened. You can't be responsible for the choices other people make. You can't go through your afterlife condemning yourself for what happened. I do hope you do know that you are dead. You need to just let it go. Forgive yourself. You need to go to the light. Don't be afraid to go to the light. Your 2 children are here for you. They've been waiting for you. They want to escort you back to your home. Please go with them." To my amazement, the ghostly woman turns around. I see her so clearly. Her dark eyes light up, and she suddenly sees her children for the first time. They run towards her. The next thing I know, they're embracing. I watch them as they hold their mother's hands, and they guide her away, and they all vanish before my eyes. The Bigfoot looks at me, pats me on the back.
You've helped her. She's gone to the light. She's at peace now. We've been waiting for you for a long time.
He nods his head and glides away. I couldn't believe what had happened. To cut a long story short, I finished Clyde's beautiful yard for him. He was thrilled with the results. The yard on his property looked as if nature herself had splurged out a vibrant opulence on his meadow that looks like a gift from nature herself, rather than the intervention of meticulous hands that engaged in so much work to create that understated effect. Needless to say, it would seem that Clyde Parkington has not experienced any paranormal activity in his home. I noticed that the entire building had changed significantly, as if a weight had been lifted off its foundations. This is the first time I've shared my story, as some things in life are too incredulous to explain. But I will say this. I believe Bigfoots can see into the spirit world, can help spirits pass on, and help a restless spirit. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was the year 1992, or thereabouts. I proceeded on my way towards the new highly esteemed restaurant I'd been hearing raving reviews about, a restaurant in the plush, prestigious area of Mayfair in London, which borders the leafy green park called Hyde Park. It's an upscale area I visit a lot in my line of work. The streets here are gracefully lined with swank upscale Georgian townhouses, exclusive deluxe hotels, ritzy gourmet restaurants, including the world-famous bespoke tailors of Savile Row, high-class designer fashions on Bond Street, and then there's Burlington Arcade, Shepherd's Market, clusters of pubs, boutiques, so yes, you could say it's an upper-crust area. The restaurant I was visiting today, or tonight should I say, was a townhouse that had been converted into an intimate first-class dining restaurant that you needed to book in advance to secure a table, thanks to a phenomenal chef, Marcus Black, with an exceptional superlative reputation that was making waves in London. For a moment I lose my bearings, but my reliable A to Z that I can't live without helps me to find the correct street. All the houses in this block are distinguished, expensive, rather regal-looking, 3 to 5 stories of superior architecture that unblushingly pencil up into the blue sky, with a proud, presumptuous, rather pompous, self-indulgent gait. Let's just say these houses of yesteryear have laid their sturdy foundations in the soil here since the early 17 to 1800s. They unabashedly know that they look good, and anyone who visits this part of London does so too. Indeed, many have flocked here from all parts of the globe to wallow in the full-bodied history of this place, like a hippo in a watering hole in Africa. When you walk down these immodest streets with the indelible influences of bygone generations that have left their ineffaceable footprints on this place, which can be so tangibly felt, most Londoners are extremely proud of the rich imperishable history you find here, many of us shunning more modern innovative architectural styles that for us quite significantly lack the quintessential charm and enduring magnetism of older, more stately buildings that have within their secure foundations a personality exclusively of their own. Indeed, they have marinated themselves in the perennial memories of the past, like an expensive wine, so you can taste all the subtle underlying flavours, from the woody to the fruity. You can unequivocally appreciate the unique impression these buildings convey, rather like a great work of art, done by a long-since deceased master, that you might find on display at Sotheby's, like a Picasso or a Leonardo da Vinci. Little did I know that this serendipitous day would ultimately lead me on a unique journey to the Americas, that would offer up to me a bizarre, incongruous encounter that not many British people like myself are privy to experience or even know about. For many of us, our natural sceptical natures would subdue us into believing such nonsensical claims could not be remotely true. Indeed, I'm ashamed to profess I would have gladly joined them in their scathing ranks, but it is difficult to ridicule or pooh-pooh something that you've witnessed first-hand for yourself. So you can hardly entertain doubt in those circumstances. For many years I did not dare tell anyone my incredulous story, that is more in common with the work of great fiction that inspires the recruitment of a dramatic imagination. I can't imagine telling people that I'd encountered a Neanderthal-like beast in America, as that would, in my humble opinion, have invited many doubting Thomases to board my ship, that would ridicule and laugh out loud at my absurd, preposterous claims that they would clearly propose were sheer lunacy, the ramblings of someone having overindulged on the hallucinatory effects of magic mushrooms. But I assure you, this is certainly not the case. Looking back, I think I may have had this experience due to my cynical nature, almost as if the universe herself decided to throw a spanner in the works and say, "There you go. Put that in your pipe and now smoke it." Let's just say the experience completely threw me out of my self-contained, rather cosy, comfortable bubble that I'd nestled in for so long. Some of us love to believe the status quo. It fits our lives like a glove, and stepping out of its secure boundaries can make us feel as nakedly vulnerable and conspicuous as a tortoise without a shell. After my experience, I began to see the world in a brand new light, for there is no going back down the old paths, as my view of everything had shifted dramatically. I began to realize, under the vast circular plains of our earth and the scaffolding of the sky, are indeed many clandestine secrets and extraordinary phenomenons some of us are only beginning to comprehend. It is believed that the great Nikola Tesla is said to have mastered the ability to time travel, to see the past, the present and future all at once. I'm open to the concept of portals, time shifts, galaxies, different life forms on other planets and other dimensions, something which years ago I would have had a field day tearing apart with my rigid, stereotype, conventional views of reality. These days, when someone tells me something that on the surface may sound ludicrously bizarre, I'm more inclined to believe them than dismiss their ballsy account. One thing I'd like to point out is that no one is going to put themselves out there and profess to something so idiosyncratic that it just invites abuse and ridicule. I mean, who does that? Unless they thoroughly enjoy being the butt of everybody's jokes, or considered as loopy as a fruitcake. I hasten to say, there are many out there like myself, hanging on to secrets they will never share, and I don't blame them. They're reticent in coming forward to share their extraordinary stories. But in an anonymous medium like this, I welcome this perfect opportunity to share my account with you and your listeners. As is the case with every story, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. A perfect sequence of events that glide seamlessly into each other to create a whole. By all accounts, depriving you of one segment of my story would be doing you a great disservice and make the impact of my account so much less punchy, and I wouldn't do that. It would make me a lousy storyteller, failing to do justice to a remarkable account that deserves its full elucidation. The little gourmet restaurant I was eagerly trying to locate, I soon found tucked in the corner of a very quiet street. I observed elegantly dressed diners arriving at the restaurant for dinner. There was a large green vintage-coloured awning on the outside windows, with gold writing on it, similar to the awnings outside Harrods department store. My job as a restaurant critic means I visit restaurants around London and other parts of the UK, and I write up food reviews about them. I hasten to say a bad review from a restaurant critic can be detrimental, damaging to your business. I always try to enter the restaurant looking as inconspicuous as I can. It's important to maintain a level of discretion. On this occasion I'm meeting another restaurant critic called Alfonso. He's my very best friend, but I'm the first to arrive. I hope to give off the impression that we're a happily married couple, which is the quintessential perfect disguise when you're undercover, writing a review under, let's say, cloak and dagger. The trouble is that Alfonso is so gay with very dramatic effusive gestures. He dresses with such a debonair style. He often just stands out. He'll say things like, "Oh, my darling, let me just say, the food today was just mwah, mwah." Now I ask you, how many straight men actually talk like that? They don't. I remember at one restaurant I'd been to, me and Alfonso pretended to be a happily married couple, and when I retreated to the powder room, a very sweet, rather flustered old woman hurriedly ran in after me. I don't know how to tell you this, dear. You seem like a terribly nice lady." She stumbled over her words. I just think you have the right to know the truth. I believe your husband is a closet gay. I want to tell you this because my husband was having an affair for many years. Years and years, actually, and everybody knew about it except me. I felt like a prize idiot. I don't have any evidence about your husband, dear, but he's got that gay look about him that warrants investigation. I tried not to crack up laughing. "Oh, I'm so sorry to have offended you, dear," she continued, "but if it were me, I would want to know." I thanked the woman profusely for caring so much. I returned to Alfonso to tell him to tone down his ebullient dramatic gestures, but let's just say it's a little like telling a caged tiger not to roar. Alfonso's gushing vociferousness can be unbridled at the best of times. I'm greeted at the door by a smart waiter, wearing a black bow tie, a white pleated shirt, black chinos, and a short white starched apron around his middle. "It's a table for two," I say to him, under the name of Mackenzie. My real name is Sullivan, but of course I don't want people to recognise that name. It might alert them to giving me exemplary service, in order to get a good write-up. "My husband will be joining me," I tell the waiter, hoping with all my heart that this time Alfonso is going to play the quintessential role of the perfect husband today, and restrain his impassioned tendencies to gallop into an animated, gushing exuberance. Of course, every woman on the planet, well, most of them, adore gay men like Alfonso, and he is my best friend. Even so, I don't want to experience sorrowful glances from pitying guests at the restaurant who clearly think that I'm a naive, callow London housewife, blindly oblivious, impressionable and ignorant to my husband's homosexual leanings. The waiter leads me to my table, that overlooks a large French window onto the street, where you can see the red brick Georgian houses on the opposite side of the road, and observe passers-by walking down the street, women with their prams, people walking dogs, and men carrying copies of the Evening Standard or Wall Street Journal under their arms, along with bottles of wine to enjoy with dinner, while the odd car rolls down the large ribbon of asphalt. It's a quiet area, where hanging baskets ablaze with colourful blooms serenade entranceways, fringed in by wrought iron fencing, and there are rows of polished front doors with porticos. The oakwood tables at the restaurant are sumptuously covered in pristine, starched white tablecloths, and large wine glasses that shine so brightly they sparkle. You'd be hard-pressed to find a tiny smudge on any of them, as everything has been polished within an inch of its life. If you tap these high-quality glasses, they tinkle like a musical instrument. The restaurant already has a buzzing ambience. The waiter hands me the huge, impressive menu. To my amazement, I find there are rather unusual dishes on the menu that I've never seen in French cuisine before, like Texas-style oven brisket, cheese blintzes, king crab with macaroni and cheese, Greek-style snapper, Cincinnati chili, chicken soup with matzo balls, chicken pot pie and potato salad, and leek and potato soup served with cornbread. It strikes me as peculiarly strange that this restaurant appears to have an American twist. I'm curious to taste some of these dishes, and my taste buds are already drooling with eager anticipation. When Alfonso walks into the restaurant, as usual he exudes his usual charm, gyrating his arms effusively. "Oh, I'm here to have dinner with my beautiful wife over there," he tells the waiter, pointing in my direction. The waiter tries not to look surprised. "That's your wife over there." It's obvious what he's thinking. I didn't expect you to be married to a woman. Far from being that discreet married couple, in the corner at the far table that overlooks the street, the affable Alfonso is already drawing attention successfully to himself, as eyes on the tables of other diners appear to be curiously glancing in his direction, as he elegantly moves towards me. Soon stares are burning into us inquisitively. Alfonso, of course, is looking incredibly debonair this evening. He is 6 foot tall, with a slender, well-toned physique, and a groomed, manicured face that's always dappled with a day-old stubble, as a fashion look, rather than a man being too lazy to shave, for there is nothing remotely lazy about Alfonso when it comes to his appearance. His hair is short on the sides, so that it is almost shaven, and slightly spiky on the front, where it stands up, thanks to an extortionate use of hair gel. I often secretly wondered how much Alfonso actually spends on hair gel a month. He probably gets through half a bottle a day, I should imagine. Today he's wearing a stylish pair of dark-washed jeans, with a fabulous well-fitting white cotton shirt, and a dark blue blazer, with only one middle button done up. He's wearing a pair of butterscotch leather boots. A matching bag is slung over his shoulders. "Hello, darling," he says, kissing me affectionately on both cheeks and throwing his arms around me. He pushes me back to have a look at me. "Darling, you look fabulous today. I love the black dress. It suits you." "Shh," I whisper in his ear. "Everyone is looking at us. Remember, you're supposed to be my husband. Calm down. Tone down the enthusiasm, will you?" Goodness gracious, you're like an unrestrained, hyped-up dog that hasn't seen its owner for over a month. People can't help but stare at you, Alfonso. It's your unrestrained, touchy-feely energy. Alfonso takes off his jacket, throwing it on the back of the upholstered chair. "What's wrong with a gay man meeting up with his good friend for dinner?" he says. "Why do we pretend that we're married anyway? I'm sure people aren't buying it." "It would be a great disguise if you learned to keep your arms still and were a little less over the top in your mannerisms." "I will try my best to come across as the perfect husband," says Alfonso, grinning. "So what is your first impression?" he asks me, his eyes scanning around the restaurant curiously, with the piercing perception of a savvy hawk. As Alfonso misses nothing. "I think it's perfectly charming. I rarely do. Tucked away inconspicuously in a Mayfair street. It's so elegant and stylish. But let's just say the menu is rather curious. I mean, look at this. King crab with mac and cheese, and Texas brisket served with a garden salad." "I agree," pipes Alfonso. "Looks like the French chef here has spent some time in America. This is going to be an interesting journey. A food experience I shan't forget in a hurry." Let's just say that when our meal arrived, even the effusive Alfonso was lost for words, and that never happens, as we tasted the dishes on offer, and the Texas brisket just melted into our mouths. And as for the mac and cheese, I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. "I'm in love," says Alfonso, sighing. "What?" I say, looking at him with a baffled expression on my face. "You never told me. Spill. I want to know all about him. And don't you dare avoid missing out any of the saucy details. Do you understand? When did you meet him? Whereabouts did you meet him?" "I haven't met my lover yet," says Alfonso presumptuously, "but I'm about to." To my amazement, he starts waving his arms in the air, like a manic octopus, which causes many diners to give Alfonso a slightly disapproving look. But he's not subdued in his desire to get the waiter's attention. The waiter comes bustling over to our table. "Sorry, sir, and madam," he says politely. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is just fabulous," says Alfonso. "Couldn't be better. Might I have a word with your chef?" "I'm sorry, sir. The chef is very busy right now. But if you have a message, I would gladly pass it on to the chef on your behalf." Alfonso pulls out a notepad from his bag and scribbles a message, handing it back to the waiter.
"What did you write?" I ask him. "I wrote, 'I'm in love. Gentleman at table number 8.
You didn't. You didn't write that. You think the chef is going to abandon his kitchen for a note like that? Are you crazy? He'll think you're as mad as a hatter. Besides, what makes you think that he would respond to such a strange note? And how can you be sure that he's actually gay?"
"People are curious," says Alfonso. "Wait and see. If he's straight, he'll hide away in the kitchen, bury himself under the confetti of white dishes. But if he's single, and if he's gay and curious, he'll be out of that kitchen faster than you can say, Jack Robinson."
What? Are you mad? It seemed Alfonso was absolutely right, much to my shock. As sure as eggs is eggs, the tall figure of the chef emerged from the kitchen, ambling over to our table with a warm smile on his face. I did not fail to notice that Alfonso and Marcus had some chemistry between each other. They locked eyes with each other, and there was an electricity between them, or to be more subtle, a mutual attraction. Although in the case of this chef, he was not as obviously gay as Alfonso.
"I hope you enjoyed your meal tonight, madam and sir,"
he says in a warm American drawl, which catches us completely off guard. I suppose we should have been surprised, given the American influences over the menus. I think we had presumed that the chef was actually French, but we were clearly wrong.
"You're American. How wonderful,"
says Alfonso, shaking the chef's hands warmly.
"I like America, and I love Americans, but I didn't expect you to be American. I'm pleasantly surprised about this. It's a pleasure to meet a man of such consummate, accomplished talent like yourself. Your menu is inspirational, unpretentious, wholesome and nurturing, refreshingly different. I like it. I really like it. Please, will you do us the honour of sitting down?"
he says to the chef, pulling out a chair from the table, and indicating for Marcus Black to take a seat, which he does so unhesitantly. Alfonso then calls over the waiter, and instructs him to bring Marcus Black what he would like to drink.
"That'll be a gin and tonic, sir,"
he says, scurrying away dutifully.
"My name is Alfonso. I just want you to know no one shortens it to Alf. Wouldn't dream of it," says Marcus. "My name is Marcus Black."
Alfonso's eyes are locked on the chef. He's a handsome man, with blonde long hair that licks against his neck, and blue eyes. He's every bit Alfonso's type, in every single regard. "You're from America, I say. I must admit I thought it was pretty lame to put macaroni and cheese on the menu. But now I have to retract my words. Not only did it work with the king crab, it literally melted in the mouth like butter. But that Texas-style brisket, oh my word, that was something else. I've never tasted anything so good." The chef looks pleased.
"It's very good, isn't it?" he says proudly. "That's because it's been cooking all day long. It falls off the bone. It's so tender. But let's just say, it's not just the slow cooking, but the marinade that's the big secret to procuring a very spicy barbecue taste like that."
"Where did you learn to cook like that?" I ask. "Alfonso here is in love with your food, and it's not just your food that is captivating his attention, I might add."
"Would you believe it? I learned to cook from my grandmother. Growing up, I was always a hungry, skinny boy. The farmhouse where I grew up with my grandmother was just filled with these incredible smells that wafted all over the house. That woman could cook. She runs cooking classes, you know. People all over the world, between 3 or 8 people, book a week with my grandmother to learn the art of Southern cuisine. They stay in her farmhouse for an entire week. If you enjoy cooking, you absolutely must go and book a week's course with her. You'll never ever regret it. No one ever does. She can teach you how to make the brisket and the delicious macaroni cheese that I served tonight. The courses aren't excessively expensive, but very worthwhile. It'll change the way you cook for life, and you'll learn about American food and our great classics." "Where does she live?" asked Alfonso curiously. "In Springdale. It's a town in Utah. It's where I grew up as a boy. The house is situated outside the boundaries of Zion National Park, which attracts tourists to Utah every year. People love going hiking there. The canyons are spectacular to observe." "More to the point," says Alfonso, surprising me by his directness. I'm wondering if he's flirting at this point, because it's about as brazenly audacious as you can get. But then again, subtlety is not always Alfonso's strong point. If you ask him to pick out a tie, it'll be the loudest tie you've ever seen, but definitely tasteful, as style is Alfonso's second name. "I'd like to go when you're going," he says presumptuously. I notice the chef's face flushes pink, but he likes Alfonso's directness, I think. "As it happens, I'm going there next week, flying there," he says. "I'll also be staying at the house. I could tell my grandmother that you would like to spend a week with her doing cookery. The afternoons will be free for you. I could show you around in the afternoons if you like." He hesitates. "If you're serious, I can call her now." He looks quizzically at Alfonso. His blue eyes say nothing, but I can see the unwritten words, hear the unarticulated thoughts. For Marco's expression is as translucent and revealing as a Portuguese man of war. It's as if he's saying, "Bloody hell, I know you're gay, and you're married. What are you doing, bro? It's obvious you're flirting with me. Does your wife not know what's going on here?" Alfonso lets out a loud snort. "Married to her," he chuckles, pointing at me, as if the idea of being married to me is quite possibly the most hilarious suggestion that he's ever heard. I'm not sure exactly how to take that, especially when he rudely pipes, "Are you kidding? Never in a month of Sundays. Never would I marry Sue." Of course, I don't take offence with Alfonso. Sometimes he speaks before he thinks, and he hasn't got a mean bone in his body, but he has on occasion ruffled people by saying exactly what he thinks a little too freely. He can be completely tactless. That is not an understatement. "Thanks a lot, Alfonso. You make it sound as if the very idea of being married to me is appalling. Too appalling to contemplate. I'll have you know I'm actually quite a catch." "For a fisherman that likes his fish to swim one way with a heterosexual grace, then you're definitely a good catch," he says, giving Marcus a huge wink. "But I thought—" "Please," laughed Alfonso. "Do I look straight?" The chef laughs. "Not at all. That was the problem. But you did tell my waiter you were married. Do you make a habit of pretending to be married all the time?" "We're restaurant critics," whispers Alfonso under his breath. "I'm only telling you, as we shall be writing a great review about your restaurant, so there's no need for us to keep up the pretense." "Glad to hear it, but if I were you, I think I'd cut out the married act. I don't think anyone's seriously going to buy it, and if they do, it's only going to look bad on you, Sue. It's going to look like you are naive about your husband's real leanings. You are obviously so gay," he says to Alfonso. "It stands out a mile. So the two of you, I hope, will fly over to America next week. Join me at my grandmother's house. I would be very delighted if you would. Is that a deal? Are we on the same page?" "Absolutely," says Alfonso. "I'm paying for your tickets, Sue, so you better be coming. If you like it or not." "How can I refuse?" I say. So there you are, one night spent in a gourmet restaurant with my best friend Alfonso, pretending to be my husband, ends up with an unlikely encounter with an American chef called Marcus Black, who had subsequently invited us on a week's cookery course, where the mornings would be spent creating some southern dishes with his grandma in Utah, of all places. I knew the real attraction of the trip for both men was their clandestine immediate interest in each other,
They were equally guarded about their feelings, as if they knew they were treading cautiously down a precarious, uncertain path when you don't know someone terribly well, and are feeling the temperature of the water and getting acquainted with your bearings. Alfonso knew from hardened experience that attraction and chemistry were certainly not enough in a potential relationship. I think they both wanted to ensure that the road they were embarking upon was made up of smooth pebbles, not hostile glass fragments that could potentially cut your feet to shreds. The cookery course would be a seamless way for the two men to get to know each other better before the relationship, if indeed it became a relationship, developed into something much more serious. Let's just say there was always a risk. Things could potentially go pear-shaped between the two men. Even though Alfonso was in-your-face and effusive character, there was a reticent, reserved, self-effacing side to his character. He didn't do one-night stands or light-hearted flings. He was the type of man that was looking for a committed, enduring relationship. I knew, in this unassuming American chef, Marcus Black, he had sensed a connection between the two of them. Ostensibly, Alfonso had bountiful failed relationships behind him, so he was searching for stability in his life. I knew as his best friend I had to come along on this trip for good measure, so that should things fall apart, I could be a buffer for him.
"I'm not going to get excited about this trip," he told me, "but you sense the chemistry between us. I'm looking forward to getting to know Marcus Black better, but I'm not going to rush anything. I've been burnt too many times."
Good for you. But don't get your hopes up, Alfonso. Chemistry is a good start, I admit, but you know it's not enough. It's like the kindling that gets the fire going. But if there's wet wood on the flames, the fire will burn out, and that could potentially be the two of you.
"Don't I know it?" says Alfonso. "That's why you're coming along with me, Sue. I wouldn't have the guts to do this without you. I'm very grateful you're coming."
A week later. This was my first trip to America. I had visited places in Europe, been to Asia, India and Africa, but I'd never been to America before. Of course, I was suffering from jet lag, but when I arrived in the town of Springdale, I was completely enchanted. Visiting America was like climbing out of a tight pair of jeans that you never knew were restrictive until you put on a looser pair. You suddenly breathe again. You feel less trussed up, more comfortable in the baggier pair, as if you can almost do anything you desire without the claustrophobic restriction of a clinging fabric squeezing you so tightly. You look back at your cramped jeans with a realization that they were much more compact than you actually realized. The tight jeans are England, with its much more narrow, confined scenery, cute little country lanes and fields, whereas America just feels so vast. You feel as if you're in a place that's so large it stretches back for miles, while the scenery in Utah will quite literally take your breath away. I was welcomed to the undulating, sweeping twists of the canyons, with sheer mountain drops, ridges, spirals and butts that arrested the skyline in a magisterial dominance that demands your respect, your focus, intrigue, and reverential awe. If you think of your archetype Western movie, you might think of Utah, with its vast stretches of sandy desert, deep, treacherous canyons that invite your admiration to venture on its own voyage of discovery. For there is nothing reticent, retiring, or reserved about these masterful backdrops and towering red rocks that inspire the intrepid explorer within you to make its appearance known. Let's just say in the developed areas of this space, where houses nestle like tiny matchboxes beneath the mountains, there is a green belt of mowed lawns, bountiful trees of many kinds, standing out so vibrantly against the tan and red rugged contours of the mountains, that by contrast everything looks so small to those mountains. I was to find that the town here gave off a contagious, convivial energy, and I couldn't help but feel that it would be very difficult to be depressed here. How can you look at such extraordinary beauty and be downhearted? Mrs. Black, Marcus's grandmother, lived in a house that was surrounded by the sheer awesome wonders of Zion National Park. On the day we arrived at her house, the mountains were blurred by a foggy haze that transformed them into a faint bluish-purple colour, The house was situated on over an acre of land, almost steps away from the Virgin River, which is a tributary of the Colorado River. The house is a double-story symmetrical farmhouse, painted in a deep apricot colour that blends perfectly with the bronze colours of the canyons. It has large windows, balconies on the highest level, and a standard grey slate roof, surrounded by fields of sagebrush and tall shrubland, while the land itself is splattered with cottonwoods, mixed conifers, spruce firs, junipers, mixed pines. Mrs. Black came out to greet us warmly, as if she'd known us all our lives, as her friendliness was so charged by a natural nurturing spirit. Suffice to say, the moment that Alfonso and Marco saw each other again, it was even more electric than at the restaurant that day in Mayfair. For a moment they were almost too shy to embrace each other. Needless to say, they cordially shook hands, and Mrs. Black gave me a knowing wink. She took me discreetly to one side and said, "I've never seen Marcus like this before. He was most insistent that I invite the both of you on this cookery course together. I've never known him to be so pushy about anything. But let's just say I smelt a rat, and now I can see it," she says, looking at Alfonso, giggling happily. "I like him," she says to me. "I really like him. He's a good man, I admit. A bit over the top, but that's part of his charm. Yet underneath it all, he's quite a sensitive man. I think Alfonso is quite smitten by your grandson. He was in love with his cooking before he even met him. I worry about my grandson," says Mrs. Black. "He's been hurt in so many of his relationships before. It's been the history of his life. People he trusted letting him down again and again. He never knew who his father was, but my daughter, his mother, let's just say, is a free spirit, who's never been responsible a day in her life. Over the years we got random phone calls from her, but Marcus never met her. He still hasn't. It's easy to take it personally when your own mother has never bothered to get in contact with you over the years, or even pay you a fleeting visit. I mean, who does that? He'd say it didn't bother him at all, but I know it did. Marcus is a very sensitive soul under it all. He's not interested in casual relationships. It's a bit like that with Alfonso, I say to her. I do hope it works out for the two of them. I really do. Let's just say learning to cook all this American food was phenomenal, as Marcus's grandmother made the inspirational cooking so much fun. I noticed Alfonso and Marcus were spending a lot of spare time together, visiting coffee shops, cafes, and even having dinner together at restaurants in town. I gave them the space to go off and do their own thing. To put it mildly, I'd never seen Alfonso radiate so much happiness before. I knew he was falling hard for Marcus, and the American chef seemed to be walking with a skip to his step. So let's just say a smouldering romance appeared to be brewing on the horizon. One night in the farmhouse, where I slept in a cosy, well-appointed bedroom on the second floor, which was air-conditioned, because let's say Utah in the summer months can be scorchingly hot. It was an attractive, airy room, painted in a neutral colour, with a large sliding door that opened out onto a wrought iron balcony, with pretty views over the countryside. On this occasion I am awoken with a start. I'm not sure why. I'm normally a deep sleeper. The temperature in my room was absolutely perfect, but I had a funny feeling that something was off, that warranted my investigation. I'm not sure where the strange feeling came from. I'm not exactly instinctive. It's like sensing there's an intruder in the house or something. I ambled out of my bed, putting on my dressing gown and slippers, and decided I would warm myself some hot milk. I was being completely ridiculous, I know, irrational and nonsensical. I must have dreamt something, I thought, that I hadn't remembered, that had provoked within me an attack of the heebie-jeebies. Of course, that must be it. I told myself quite sternly to pull myself together. I trundled down the long sweeping staircase towards the kitchen, switching on the light, and that's when I heard a clattering sound coming from outside the kitchen door that made me believe something or someone is ferreting around in the bin outside. Mrs. Black had told me all about the raccoons and how annoying they could sometimes be when they rummage in your dustbins. But she also commented that on occasion black bears had wandered onto her property to go through the dustbins, as sometimes she throws out leftovers, and the bears have a great sense of smell and are highly attracted to the food offerings. I think Mrs. Black thought I knew all about bears and how they behaved. She was rather presumptuous like that. I may be well educated, but I don't really know a lot about bears. Growing up, I'd always associated them with cuddly toys that you took to bed with you. I even had an antique collection of bears at home, so in my mind's eye, my attitude to bears was not as guarded as it possibly should have been. I find a torch on the kitchen windowsill and quickly open up the back door. The moonlight is spectacular tonight, a round, circular, luminescent face that smiles through the sky, saddling its light across the horizon, so the night has a lightness to it, while the stars twinkle brightly from the firmament with a vibrancy I've never seen before. I hear the loud clattering sound again, and what appears to be a very frustrated grunt that reminds me of the sound of a child having a tantrum because he's being served baked beans for dinner yet again. Now that grunting sound has made me very curious. I decide it's got to come from a bear, but this I have to see for myself. Bear in mind, we don't have bears loitering in our backyards in Britain. If we want to see a bear in England, we need to plan a visit to the zoo. So for me, this was an experience of note. I switch off my torchlight and creep cautiously out into the backyard, gliding against the wall and attaching myself to it like a limpet to remain as obscure as I possibly can. I am now facing the semicircular driveway. I can see the carport clearly, where two trucks, a red Dodge Viper that belongs to Marcus Black and a white Ford Taurus that belongs to his grandmother, are parked stoically together. I notice the large bin is standing up beside the carport, and what appears to be a great big bear is literally throwing out all the garbage in the bin over a giant-sized shoulder to the ground below, going through it with a fine tooth comb, as if searching for a tasty morsel to eat. I imagine this bin is often filled with tasty food. The previous day Mrs. Black had thrown out over a dozen day-old cinnamon buns that had passed their best, but they were still delicious, I imagine. Mrs. Black's kitchen always reeks of the pleasant aromas of her amazing food, that not only waft over her house, but I'm certain the scent could be picked up by a hungry bear a mile away. The bear slams the bin shut, impressively scooping up all the spilled contents from the ground right back into the bin again. Now what bear would be so neat, so conspicuously tidy, so conscientious? It seemed like odd behaviour to me for a bear. I couldn't help thinking that this creature was large for a bear, standing up on 2 feet. The creature's gait was so straight, his deportment graceful, but his silhouette so human-like. But then what did I know? I was no expert on bears. That was when I hear a whistle, and another bear emerges from the shadows. It's indicating to the larger creature that was ferreting in the bin, as if to say, "Come here, look what I've found." The two creatures are standing outside Mrs. Black's white Ford Taurus and appear to have opened the trunk. Then I remember that Mrs. Black had left some groceries in the back of the trunk, the non-perishables, when she had been distracted by a phone call yesterday. I think she accidentally left them overnight, possibly forgetting about them, because with bears out there, they would happily grab onto that food. The trunk was slightly ajar, and the creatures begin to rummage excitedly through the plastic bags of groceries, chattering enthusiastically together. Then I hear them talking. I know that this cannot be a bear. Bears don't talk. They don't chat like this. Also, the creatures are taking care to keep their voices very quiet. The creatures are selective about what they're taking. The large creature fumbles with a jar of peanut butter, opening up the lid, as if he's actually done this before. They both smell the jar, and thick fingers submerge themselves in this sumptuous gooey treat, and I can hear the oohs and ahs of appreciation as they gobble it all up. But these creatures, they're not bears. I've noticed thick sausage-like fingers tucking into the peanut butter. Bears don't have fingers. I can't see the creatures as clearly as I would like to, even though the moonlight has graciously made the sky less tenebrous. I don't want to shine my torch in these creatures' faces, but I do want to see what they are. I'm so confounded by what I'm observing. These creatures appear intelligent. They're talking in a strange language, or putting a few items into one of the bags, and for some reason the torch I'd been carrying just falls to the ground, crashing onto the paving with a loud, thunderous smash. I am now terrified, The creatures both stop eating at once. They look at each other as if startled by the noise. Before I can quickly retreat to the kitchen, the two creatures are standing yards away from me, staring at me with astonishment in their bright yellow eyes. I don't know who is more surprised, me in seeing them, or them in seeing me. These creatures are tall, lofty, majestic, insanely large. So much so that I feel tiny in their presence. They have pyramid-shaped heads, human faces, overlong arms, and are easily about 8 foot tall, and 4 foot wide across the shoulders. One is male, the other female, as the female has breasts. What the hell are they? I've never been so terrified in all of my life. My heart is thumping, my legs wobbling, my hair is standing up on the back of my neck. I feel overwhelmed with terror. I must have passed out and fainted, as I remember nothing after that. My memory just goes completely blank. The next thing I know is someone is shaking me wide awake. I open my eyes to find myself lying on the outdoor sofa of the wraparound porch. It's early morning, and the pretty sunlight is filtering through the sky. The birds are tweeting. I feel disorientated and very confused. "What are you doing sleeping out on the porch?" asked Mrs. Black, looking concerned. I look a little bemused. "I'm not exactly sure," I say. "I can't remember." Mrs. Black looks down at my empty bottle of peanut butter by my side, along with an empty packet of walnuts, and she looks at me in horror. "Oh, my God! I'm not feeding you enough," she says, sounding appalled. "You came out here last night to eat the groceries in the back of my truck. Were you that hungry? You should have told me, dear, rather than sneaking to my truck for a midnight feast. A small thing like you, I didn't think you'd eat that much. But I'm so sorry. I had no clue you were starving like this. I'm clearly a dreadful, dreadful host." I glance down at the empty peanut butter bottle and the walnut packet that is scrunched by my side, and my face grows bright red, as if I've been caught doing something red-handed. I look as guilty as sin. What must Mrs. Black actually think of me? I abandoned my perfectly comfortable bed last night to apparently sleep outside on this porch. I then sneaked to her open trunk to retrieve a bottle of peanut butter and a packet of walnuts, and I have a midnight feast. Goodness gracious, she must think I'm the weirdest guest. I wanted to tell Mrs. Black about my strange encounter with these curious creatures, who must have carried me to the couch after I fainted from shock, and placed the empty bottle of peanut butter and walnuts at my side. But how can I tell her what I'd seen? I'm still struggling to get my head around it myself, and I'm not exactly sure if I told anyone about my idiosyncratic encounter, whether they'd actually believe me or not. For me it had been so surreal, like an outlandish dream. But I knew that this had happened, and after much research, I discovered the two creatures I encountered are known as Bigfoot. Suffice to say, after Mrs. Black had observed the evidence of my so-called nightly binge, where she perceived I had pilfered some groceries from her half-open trunk to fill a malnourished stomach, groaning with hunger, she began to pile my plate so high with food that even Alfonso commented on the size of my portions.
"Mrs. Black, Sue is a very small woman. Why are you giving me and Marcus normal portions of food? But Sue's food looks like you've placed Mount Everest on her plate."
Mrs. Black looked at Alfonso earnestly and said, "Son, Sue is a very hungry girl." Needless to say, I ate everything up to avoid offending Mrs. Black, but I paid for it big time. I rolled back to England like a small hippopotamus, bursting in my clothes that could barely contain me any more, only to discover my bathroom scales informed me I'd put on 1/2 stone, which is 10 pounds in 7 days. To cut a long story short, Alfonso and Marcus are now happily married, so their relationship stood the test of time. I believe the experience I had in America happened to me because I've always been so cynical. The universe was showing me, wake up, young lady. There's much more to this world than you could ever imagine. And I profoundly believe this is true. So there you are. This is my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Agatha, and I'm from the Pacific Northwest,
And if you're wondering why I'm called Agatha, it was because my mother was a huge fan of Agatha Christie's work, such as the famous detective Hercule Poirot, Miss Marple, and the quintessential world-famous story Murder on the Orient Express. My mother was addicted to all her books, which was why she chose to call me Agatha to honour her favourite author's memory. I'm not actually sure if she was hoping that I'd turn out to be an awe-inspiring sleuth myself, but if it helps, I do happen to have an inquiring mind and a natural inquisitive disposition, which counts for something, I suppose. I did, however, not happen to go missing for 11 long days, as was the mysterious case that surrounds Agatha Christie's life, that still all these years later, long after the author's death, is veiled and clouded in enigmatic circumstances that were indeed so strange and peculiar that they raised more questions than answers. And this incredulous, bizarre case was never ever unravelled or solved, but luckily she was found safe and well in a hotel in Harrogate. It would seem that Agatha Christie herself could not provide any clues as to what had happened to her. Could it be that the mysterious writer herself had surreptitiously drawn herself down a rabbit hole of mysterious intrigue that she could never resolve, as her memory may have been intentionally wiped from her mind? One can only ponder as to the answer to this curious conundrum or question. I was born and raised in the Pacific Northwest in the early 80s, in an area of exquisite natural beauty, in what I would describe as your quintessential wooden ranch-style home that overlooked the exquisite mountains, undulating verdant countryside, along with a pretty charming creek and a backdrop of ponderosa pines and Douglas firs that made up a very pretty savanne on our land that stretched back for a considerable distance. We lived on about 60 acres of land, where we owned a few free-range chickens, along with an incredibly annoying rooster that would make the biggest cock-a-doodle-doo noises at the crack of dawn that would sometimes drive me completely potty. We also owned 2 French bulldogs called Gus and Louis that quite literally thought the sun shone out of my father's backside, possibly because my father manipulated and bribed them with delicious doggy treats and took them on lovely afternoon walks in the countryside. Our flat-faced adorable dogs did enjoy sleeping on the couch and snoring for a long part of the day, and when they had enough energy, they were natural comedians that brought a smile to our faces every day of our lives, and one could not help but love them to death. My incredulous, outlandish Bigfoot story begins when I was studying for my 12th grade midterm exams, and I was about 17 at the time. My parents and my brother Paul, along with our 2 French bulldogs, were going away for the weekend, and I decided I needed to stay at home because I had tons of swatting to do. You know what I'm like. I'd much rather be doing anything else in the world other than studying. Well, the place will be very quiet for you, my mother said, but then maybe that's exactly what you need. I watched my parents, along with our 2 bulldogs, and my brother driving away from the premises down the long gravel driveway, and all of a sudden the house became incredibly quiet and very still. I made myself a cup of coffee, put on some calming background music, and began to study. It was now 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the telephone rang, and I could hear heavy breathing, and I quickly slammed down the phone in disgust and returned to my work. The phone rang 3 more times, and once again I could hear the low, guttural, heavy breathing down the end of the line, which became increasingly unsettling. I tried to think about whether someone had an axe to grind with me, or possibly one of my friends was playing a trick on me, or was just some lone loser trying to scare the living daylights out of me. I thought back to the most recent relationship that had ended 3 weeks prior. I had been introduced to this young man called Jed at a party, and had been on several dates with him, but the relationship had fizzled out because we simply had nothing in common with each other, and when I told him it wasn't working out and that we should call it a day, he had reacted in a rather nonchalant way with an air of indifference and had just said, "Fine, if that's the way you want it." And his expression had been so dead and disinterested, I really didn't think he cared at all. I thought it was unlikely it would be him calling me like this, but then who else could it possibly be?
I was befuddled and confused, and tried to reflect on whether anyone knew I was home alone for the weekend. But I'd only ever told Lacey, my best girlfriend, about it, and I doubt whether she'd informed anyone else, but I decided to give her a call on the off chance she might just happen to have mentioned it to someone, that I would be home alone. I've been receiving weird phone calls, I told her. Someone keeps breathing heavily down the phone, and it's creeping me out. You never happened to tell anybody else that I was home alone this weekend, did you? Quite sure, said Lacey. I don't think I mentioned it to anyone. You're probably just receiving a random call from a perfect stranger who's somehow getting his kicks out of scaring you half to death. What a complete jerk. Or, of course, it could be some kids pulling a hoax on you. I wouldn't worry about it if I was you. Just don't answer the phone if it makes you feel any better. You're probably right, Lacey, I said, deciding that I needed to return to my studies, and I gave the matter no further thought. Once again the phone began to ring and ring and ring, but I completely ignored it, and then it rang again and again, and with the rising level of trepidation and angst, I stood staring at the phone on the hall table, shaking like a leaf and feeling too scared to pick up the receiver, and even my heartbeat began to increase in intensity as I began to feel increasingly apprehensive. And then, in a spontaneous moment of boldness, I quickly put my hand on the receiver and lifted the phone nervously to my ear. "Hello," I said, and there was a long, drawn-out, uncomfortable pause, and then I heard the heavy breathing again. My rising level of panic and trepidation was suppressed and overtaken by the smouldering anger that had ignited like a light to a cigarette. How dare someone try to scare me like this, I thought. "This isn't funny," I said. "If you think this is a joke, guess what? I'm not laughing."
"I know you are home alone,"
said this raspy voice that I didn't recognize. "Who is this? Who is this?" I asked.
"Would you not like to know?" said the voice, and I could hear a low, guttural laugh.
"Well, for your information, I just happen not to be alone," I said. "My parents are at home."
"You and I know that is not true," came an ominous chuckle.
"Go away," I screamed, slamming down the receiver violently, as if it was about to lash out and bite me, and eyeing it with a renewed sense of wariness, like a dangerous predator that I would sooner rather avoid. My phone had suddenly become as threatening and oppressive as a wild animal lurking ominously in the dark shadows, waiting to pounce on me. I just wish I knew what I was dealing with, as the not knowing who was at the other end of the line was the hardest thing of all. It could be a bunch of silly kids targeting me randomly and having a laugh at my expense, or it could be someone who knew me with nefarious intent. By this time I was shaking so much that it was very difficult to compose myself, and I seriously considered giving the sheriff a call, but I felt silly about phoning him over some erroneous fallacious prank call. As far as I was concerned, he might think I was overreacting, and I'd end up feeling like a silly little schoolkid who couldn't be taken seriously. The rest of the afternoon rolled along smoothly, sweeping seamlessly into the evening, and everything went by without a hitch, and the phone did not ring at all, except for one time when my mother was checking in on me. "Just wanted to let you know, darling, we've arrived safe and sound, and all is well. We settled into the delightful cabin here. It's awfully pretty, and Louis and Gus are having the time of their lives, and I sense the owner of the cabin has a soft spot for French bulldogs, and she gave them both a couple of sausages, but when she bent down, Louis grabbed both sausages from her hands, leaving nothing for Gus, and promptly scuttled away to eat them up. The woman began to laugh so much she was actually snorting. "That's so typical," I said, laughing. "Louis is so greedy, the little rascal. I do hope you made up for the shortfall. I'd hate poor Gus to lose out." "Of course I did, dear. You know me." "Are you sure you'll be all right, sweetheart?" said my mother. "Oh, I know I'm being overprotective, but I really don't like you being home alone. It unnerves me a little, even though I know you'll be safe." "I know, Mum," I said,
But don't worry about me. I'll be absolutely fine. After the telephone call, I went to the kitchen and made myself some melt-in-the-mouth toasted cheese under the grill and a cup of hot coffee, and returned to my study. It was very hard to concentrate. How was I going to remember all these dates in our American history and the sequence and order of historic events? It was like my mind was ablaze with a kaleidoscope of numbers and words, and before long it became clouded and fuzzy, and I realised that my concentration was waning and that I was just staring at my notes blankly, failing miserably at absorbing any more information. I know when my mind gets foggy like this, I have to call it quits, because there is a point when my brain shuts down, and it's futile trying to focus. I promptly went around the house double-checking the security, that every door was locked and all the windows were shut, and then I dressed in my pyjamas and made a mug of hot chocolate overloaded with marshmallows and a bowl of popcorn, and I watched a funny comedy on the television, which caused me much laughing, and then retired to bed. I had long since forgotten about the hair-raising airy phone calls earlier on in the afternoon, and I sank gratefully into my sheets, pulling my duvet over my head, and began to slip into a wonderful world of dreams. I woke with a start and groaned in frustration to hear the phone ringing in the hallway. I glanced briefly at the clock. It was 12:10. I mean, who phones at this time of the night, I thought angrily, sensing in my gut that the nightmarish calls had begun all over again. Why would they not leave me alone, I thought, choosing to ignore the calls, but the phone just rang and rang and rang. I lay in my bed, my heart pounding and my anxiety levels rising, and I climbed out of the bed and surreptitiously crept silently to the hallway and stared at the phone as if it was as dangerous and inauspicious as a wild predator. I felt almost too afraid to answer it. Finally, I put my shaking hands onto the receiver while the phone just continued to ring. Eventually, in a moment of gallant, intrepid courage, I quickly picked up the receiver. "Hello," I said. "Who is this?" Once again, I heard the heavy, raspy breathing. "Who is this? Who is this?" I screamed down the phone. "I'm coming to get you," said the voice. I quickly put down the phone and ran to the kitchen to grab a knife, and then I looked out of every window in my house, but all I could see was the dusky sky with a scattering of stars, along with the full moon. And I went around the house, putting on all the outside lights so that I could feel more secure inside, but I couldn't see anything. All of a sudden, after about 10 minutes, I heard a loud clanging noise behind the kitchen door, and nearly jumped out of my skin, but it was only a couple of raccoons ferreting through our outside bin. I sighed with relief and quickly retired to bed, reassuring myself that everything was absolutely fine. Moments later I could hear the inauspicious sound of the gravel being crunched under car tyres, as someone was clearly driving down our long driveway in the middle of the night, and I could hear the vehicle grind to a sudden halt, possibly so that it could remain indistinguishable and invisible from the house. And seconds later I heard the infelicious, ill-fated sound of a car door silently shut behind itself. I could hear portentous footsteps, trying to be quiet, as they stealthily walked forwards down our gravelly driveway towards our house, and that was when I saw the dark figure, wearing a black and white Halloween mask, with the white drooping eyes and the round white open mouth, and in his arms he was carrying an axe. For a second I thought I must be dreaming. I even rubbed my eyes to make sure that I wasn't. I'd watched Halloween movies in the past, where heinous murderers had worn masks like this, but this was about as real as it gets. For a moment I was far too astonished and stunned by what I was seeing, but when the individual, whoever they were, began to start hacking down our front door with an axe, I knew instinctively that I was in serious danger and big trouble, and this odorous, diabolical individual clearly wanted me dead. I was in no mistake about that. I quickly grabbed the torch and hurried towards the kitchen door, and began running over the verdant, undulating green countryside towards the woods, as I knew this vast wooded expanse was clearly the safest place for me to take refuge, as there are many nooks and crannies and great places to hide. I began to run, with my heart pounding violently in my chest and my adrenaline coursing through my veins while I was breathing very rapidly. I realized that running behind me at a short distance was the masked man. I quickly entered the woods and began looking around frantically for somewhere to hide, and crawled under a thorn bush with jagged thorns that cut through my skin, piercing it viciously. But I didn't care and didn't even feel the fearsome jabs. But I assure you, in moments of elevated fear, you simply don't feel pain. Well, that was my experience anyway. I slid under the small gap in the bush, and thankfully my body was almost perfectly concealed by the thorny briars, and I had a great vantage point, as lying flat on my stomach I could see exactly what was going on. I knew that a thorn bush was about the safest place to hide. Then I saw him as he entered the woods, and he began thrashing the ground with his axe in a way that was designed to intimidate and terrorize me.
"I know you're there," he screamed in a raspy voice. "I'm coming to get you, and I'm going to watch you die a slow and painful death, which is what a heartless, cold-blooded bitch like you deserve. Girls like you warrant throwing in a pool of hungry crocodiles."
I could see the gruesome form of the man scanning everything with his torchlight, although in truth the moonlight on this dusky evening filtered through the trees, providing excellent visibility, which was rather unfortunate. I cannot recall a moment in my life that I'd been more afraid, for the menacing, malevolent energy this man exuded made me all too painfully aware that he most certainly wanted me dead. And whoever he was, he had a grievance against me, a crow to pluck, or an axe to grind, literally and figuratively. The man continued to search for me, and at one point he was so close to me that I could have almost touched him with stretching my hand beneath the bush, but I didn't. He seemed to have disregard for searching beneath the thorny briars.
"You bitch," came the rasping voice. "I will not rest until you're dead."
All of a sudden, out of the dark shadows, thundering through the thorny brush like a rhino in the thicket, a colossal, dark, shadowy silhouette of a huge beast appeared, that at first looked to me like a massive bear, standing upright on its haunches, towering at an impressive 9 feet off the ground. But this was no bear, for although the critter was covered in long, flowing dark hair, it possessed overlong arms and human-like hands and feet, and when its head swiveled in my direction like an owl's, it appeared to possess a strikingly human face with a sloping forehead and deep-set dark eyes that exhibited a rather menacing red eyeshine, although many of its facial features appeared to be obscured by the darkness. On seeing this extraordinary creature, it would seem that the masked man began to shake in his boots, while the critter let out the most terrifying roar that was so ear-piercing and thunderous that it almost caused the ground to shake beneath me like a mini-earthquake. Even lying under the thorn bush, I was frozen in terror, so much so that I was unable to move a single muscle. I became as solid as one of those waxwork statues at Madame Tussauds, and all I could feel was the rapid vibration of my heart pounding through my chest at an alarmingly fast rate, as it wasn't easy to watch this outlandish, peculiar creature, such as the likes that I have never seen before, unleash its wrath on the masked figure. The critter curled back its thin lips to expose its large white teeth, and although not jagged and sharp, they were still incredibly intimidating, and it got significantly worse when the critter let out the most blood-curdling growl that was so petrifying it felt like jolts of electricity surging through my body with a powerful zapping force. The masked man did not run away, which on retrospect would have been the wisest course of action for him to take, for indeed he may have escaped with his life, for who in their right mind considers challenging a critter at least 5 times heavier than they are? Instead, the masked man stood his ground and tried to lash out at the creature with the axe, but he looked like a silly kid trying to provocatively poke a crocodile with a stick. In a trice the critter's patience had worn very thin,
and he lunged towards the man and grabbed his axe from him and threw it into the forest, where it somersaulted backwards while the blade landed precariously in the ground with a brute force. The critter then tore off the long black mask, and to my horror I saw Jed, the young man that I dated, standing there in front of the savage beast, and I could see he had wet his pants, and his eyes had grown as wide as saucers. The young man began begging for his life, as he seemed incapable of running away. He was possibly too incapacitated and frozen by fear. "Please don't hurt me," he begged. But his words fell on deaf ears, as the creature swung his body around in his arms like a Catherine wheel, and then lunged towards a jagged branch on a tree, and with one powerful thrust impaled his torso through it, and within seconds Jed's body lay limp over the branch, and his eyes glazed over like a dead fish, while his mouth remained open in a gasp. I could see that Jed's body was most certainly deceased, and he had lost the fight for life. I could hear the critter grunting in disgust, and then he pulled down an entire tree trunk close to Jed's body with effortless ease, and the noise was so unsettling, as it was louder than a bullet, and then he glided away through the forest with a seamless grace. As you can imagine, I was too affrighted to move from my hiding place, and lay there in an adrenalized state of suspended terror, almost hardly daring to breathe as I held my breath. I have feared that the beast would come back, but I'm glad that he never showed up again. Once the chorus of crickets and frogs had faded, and the dawn chorus had burst forth in the forest in a crescendo of pretty tweets and warbles, I still lay there, until finally the early morning sun filtered through the trees, dappling the forest in a subtle ethereal light. It was then that I finally wiggled out of the thorn bush, shredding my skin to pieces with more scrapes and cuts. I immediately went to retrieve Jed's axe, as I thought about how horrified his mortified parents would be if they discovered their own child had tried to kill me. It was bad enough to lose your child to an animal attack, only to have your son's memory completely contaminated and soured by the horrifying knowledge that he had attempted to murder someone, as I am in no doubt that he had intended to kill me. In short, I made up a fictitious story to the sheriff, and told him that Jed was my boyfriend who had visited me, and we'd gone for a stroll in the woods together during the night, when Jed had subsequently been attacked by a bear, and I had hidden under a thorn bush, and then run away, and on seeing me, the bear had pursued me, and tried to break down our front door. It was in the 80s, and I knew that telling the sheriff about the outlandish critter that we'd encountered would be unlikely to seem believable. It would be on par with me saying, "Hi, Sheriff, by the way, I saw an abominable snowman kill Jed." I remember the sheriff saying to me that it was the strangest bear attack he'd ever seen, but he really wished that kids would be more sensible when venturing out into the woods at night, and taking a rifle with us might not have been a bad idea. A couple of weeks passed after that incident when my mother told me that I had a visitor, who I was soon to realise was Jed's mother. She asked my mother if she might have some words with me in private, and my mother had agreed, but had insisted upon making us a pot of tea and a large plate of chocolate brownies. "Be nice to her," my mother whispered. "The poor woman has suffered a grievous and tragic loss." The woman was petite and fragile, reminding me of a delicate china doll, and I watched her trembling with the teacup in her hand as she looked at me nervously through very discerning blue eyes. "I know what you told the police is not the truth," she said. "Please tell me what happened." "I'm not sure that's a good idea," I said kindly. "Sometimes the less you know, the better. I really don't want to open up any wounds for you." "Look," said the woman, "I'll be perfectly straight with you and tell you what I do know. After my son met you at the party, he was so dewy-eyed and completely smitten by you. In fact, he was so excited, he told me, 'Mum, I've met the girl I want to spend the rest of my life with. She's so beautiful.'" My eyes clouded over with tears. "Really? He said that to you? I don't understand. Personally, I didn't feel we had a connection at all. So I ended things with him. He didn't seem bothered at all. Actually, he was remarkably indifferent, and I remember thinking I'd done him a favour."
Jed was a troubled soul, his mother told me. He's always been guarded about his feelings. He may have appeared aloof and indifferent with you, but he was only masking his incredible, desperate hurt. After you broke up with him, he changed dramatically and became belligerent, aggrieved, angry, and even violent. He came home and turned my entire house into a scrapyard and broke everything in sight, from all my chairs to china. I've never seen him so moody and incensed. I was scared he was going to do something really stupid. He did not try and kill you by any chance. I tried to avoid the woman's intense stare. I knew it, she said. He did, didn't he? I nodded, tears pouring down my face like raindrops. I'm sorry, I said. I really didn't want to tell you. The woman took me into her arms and kissed my forehead. I'm so glad you did. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you so much. For what? I asked. For protecting Jed, by not telling the police the truth and dragging his name through the mud, which you could have done. You're a very generous and gracious spirit. Thank you so much. You have no idea what this means. All this happened a long time ago, and I now know that the creature I saw in the woods was a very angry, belligerent Bigfoot. I also happen to know now that Jed overheard my friend Lacey tell another girl at school that she envied me because I was home alone swatting while my parents were away. Hence he knew he would be able to scare me by phoning me all hours of the night and mask his voice by making it deep and raspy to avoid me from recognizing him. All these years later, Jed's mother and I are the closest of friends, which is really uncanny. We often meet up together for coffee, and we both have taken up art classes together and occasionally visit art galleries and speak to each other on a regular basis. I couldn't imagine not having her in my life. She's a remarkable woman. As for movies on television like Home Alone, you'll never ever catch me dead watching them, because my real-life Home Alone drama, or adventure if you like, was one hell of a nightmare. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.